This is an NBC News special report.
Good morning. We are coming on the air with breaking news. The public release of the redacted Mueller report is expected this morning. In the meantime, Attorney General William Barr and his deputy Rod Rosenstein are going to address reporters in just a few minutes. A news conference will begin. Let me just quickly walk you through what's going to happen. They're going to talk at some point later today. We will all, for the first time, get the Mueller report.
Right.
It's going to have sections blacked out, redacted sections, and it's going to be interesting TV because you're going to be with us in some cases as we're reading it and digesting it.
This will all be unfolding right before your eyes. That, of course, the Attorney General leaving this morning. We also have a shot of a press conference room at the Department of Justice where in just a few moments we're going to hear from the Attorney General. He really is the man of the moment. The Molar report, as we know, was turned into him a few weeks ago. He did not release the report right away, but rather summarized its top-line findings. He found that there was no collusion, that Mueller had decided there was no conspiracy case against President Trump or any of his associates. But on that question of obstruction of justice, Mueller himself decided not to render a legal decision. That's when William Barr stepped in and did and said there was not sufficient evidence to charge the president with obstruction of justice. And that leads us to today. For the first time, we will see the 400-page report, the underlying evidence that Mueller collected over a 2-year investigation.
And it feels like we have seen it already, but of course we got the word that it was handed over to Congress, then we got that 4-page summary, but really we have not seen anything that remotely begins to show the details of this investigation.
We've seen the top-line conclusions. We have not seen the evidence or lack thereof. Our Pete Williams, our justice correspondent, is right there in the room. You actually can see him at the bottom right of your screen, and he's on the phone. Pete, what are you expecting?
Well, we expect the Attorney General to talk about the process that led the Justice Department to prepare this report for release. He'll address to what extent there were conversations with the White House in the last couple of weeks about it, the process they went through in terms of redaction, whether the White House has asserted any executive privilege. We don't expect him to talk about the report's conclusions. We don't expect this to be, in other words, an amplification of the letters that he sent out last month in which he summarized the report. Rather, we expect him to explain how the Justice Department has come to this point today of receiving the Mueller report, what they've done in the interim since receiving it, and how it's going to be presented to the public, how they went through the process of redaction. I would think that sometime after it, sometime later this morning, it's going to be released. It'll be released to members of Congress. We believe that's what members of Congress have told us. And then at some point, we believe the plan is for it to appear on a website so that everyone can see it.
And Pete, Democrats are very upset that this news conference is being held before the release, so that reporters are at a disadvantage in terms of not being able to ask about anything in the report itself. There have been reports that the White House has had a look at this. How much do we know that they have been able to see and what input they may have had on what's about to transpire?
I don't know the answer to that, but I know that's one of the things they're going to tell us. And in terms of the White House seeing it, of course, they can't change it in any way. So the White House can't have any influence on what the report says. The one question would be, did they weigh in at all on executive privilege? Barr had said earlier that he was not going to present the report to the White House for the purposes of having them review it for executive privilege. So we expect he'll talk more about that today. So again, he wants to talk about the process of releasing it, not the content.
All right, Pete, sit tight, as I know you will. We expect Attorney General William Barr to address that podium in just a matter of moments. But we do have a moment to go to our political director, moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. And Chuck, as mentioned, we now know what the legal conclusions are here. What we don't know is what the politics will be once the American people see what underlies those conclusions. What is the evidence?
Well, look, politically, let's be frank here. The way this has been rolled out has been very helpful to the president, right? Regardless, we don't know the tone of the report. We don't have yet to read a single complete sentence. But in essence, he's gotten a 3.5-week head start, right, between Barr's summary of principal conclusions, testimony where Democrats were able to ask questions without knowledge of what was in the report, things like this. So politically, you could argue that the president and Bill Barr have neutered the greatest potential impact of this report. That said, let's see the details here. Is the issue of collusion and conspiracy, did he not bring charges because it was a lot of Russians, but not the Russian government. It was confusing, like a Russian novel can be. Or was it pretty definitive? On the obstruction, why did he not bring charges, right? Did he not bring, did Mueller decline to prosecute because it's the president and it's not clear you can indict a sitting president or charge a sitting president for this? Or did he do it because he just thought there wasn't enough evidence? And I think that will matter some. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm skeptical politically this is going to move the needle. And I'm saddened by the fact that I think the country collectively has less faith in our justice institutions right now today than they did before Mueller started. And that in itself is a pretty damning assessment, frankly, going into this thing, no matter what we find out.
Is this going to be a case of people will hear what they want to hear today and there will be plenty for everyone?
I think that is what's going to happen. I mean, take the example of Adam Schiff and Devin Nunes. These are the two leading House members that run the House Intelligence Committee, Schiff the Democrat, Nunes the Republican. The only thing the two of them agree on about this investigation is they want to see the full, unredacted Mueller report. Why? Schiff doesn't trust Bill Barr, and Nunes doesn't trust Bob Mueller. That's the bottom line. And that, in some ways, they are symbolic of that polarized partisan divide about this investigation.
All right, Chuck, hang tight there. I know you will. We want to go to our White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson.
Hi, Savannah and Lester. We know that this is a moment, right, 2 years in the making, and perhaps nobody is watching this more closely than the man in the building behind me here, President Trump. We know he's paying attention to this. He's already tweeting about it, simply saying this morning, presidential harassment in all caps via Twitter. He also tweeted what I think we will hear a lot from both the president and White House officials throughout the day here. No collusion, no obstruction. This is a video you're looking at of the president repeating those phrases time and time again since this Russia investigation had begun. It is the obstruction piece, though, that is creating most cause for concern based on our reporting and the sources that we talked to inside the White House. That is what the president's legal team will be focusing in on here, talking about, looking at very closely and combing through anything related to the potential for obstruction of justice. How will the White House handle this? We know, based on my conversation with the White House official, that they will split up into teams based at different parts of the building, each reading sections of the report once it is released, looking for specific things that potentially could be used to vindicate the president. That said, there is a sense of anxiety among allies and aides in and around the White House that even if there is nothing legally problematic for the president in this report, and there's no expectation that's the case, there could be potentially embarrassing and damaging details related to the president that could optically make him not look so great. That is the concern for folks here today, Savannah and Lester.
All right. Hallie Jackson, again, on the right of your screen, you're looking at the news conference room at the Department of Justice, where Attorney General William Barr is scheduled to come out right about now. Of course, we'll take you there. But let me swing over to NBC's Andrea Mitchell, who has some insight on what's about to transpire. Andrea?
Well, one of the things we're really looking at very closely when we talk about obstruction and collusion and the broad conclusions that were previewed by William Barr and are so suspect, frankly, is what do we learn about this, about Russia? Looking forward to 2020, counterintelligence officials want to know, what did Russia try? And even if it did not rise to the level of a criminal prosecution as determined by William Barr, if not by Mueller himself, what really do we know now about the attack on our democracy by Russia? What do we know about the relationship and about what pressure, if you will, or what hold Vladimir Putin may or may not have had on the President of the United States? Why did the president act so strangely towards Putin at everything up to and including the Helsinki news conference? All of these questions about that relationship with Russia are front and center. Why was Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, visiting with the Attorney General to possibly foreclose against foreign reactions to this report and what it means for our allies, our closest intelligence partners, about how the U.S. intelligence community may or may not have been compromised? All of these are questions that we may or may not learn depending on the redactions, and then Congress will have its role in trying to answer some of these questions, if not for impeachment purposes, if for purposes of protecting the election and making sure that this administration is committed to standing up against Russia.
All right, Andrea, thank you. And Savannah, in many ways, this may be a case of, if nothing else, this report may tell us we didn't imagine some of this stuff. Some of these things did happen. Now, where they may fall legally is another question, but that they did happen.
Well, we know this was an exhaustive investigation. It went on for more than 2 years. We know Mueller to be a meticulous investigator, so we're going to see the fruits of his work now. What they add up to and the conclusions people draw from them, we'll obviously have to wait and see. We go to Casey Hunt on Capitol Hill. And, of course, one of the most perplexing questions to come out, Casey, is why it is that Robert Mueller chose not to render a legal judgment, a conclusion as to this issue of obstruction of justice. We're about 2 minutes away from the news conference from the Attorney General. A lot of people are wondering, does that mean he wanted Congress, your beat, he wanted members of Congress to determine whether or not this was some sort of political issue?
My sources are telling me, Savannah, that is exactly the question that they want to get the answer to. And they are hoping that it doesn't fall into one of these categories of redactions that the Attorney General has laid out. They want to know what Robert Mueller's intent was, not what the Attorney General's intent was. And Democrats are already attacking this news conference that we are about to see because they don't yet have a copy of the report. The public doesn't yet have a copy of the report. So we're going to be taking everything the Attorney General says at face value. And they say, the top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, out tweeting already this morning that is an indefensible position. Now, we do know that they will be receiving copies of the report at 11 a.m. this morning via CD-ROM. They'll be delivered, we expect, to the Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, where staffers will be scrambling to read through it quickly. But, you know, Savannah, Lester, there is a real built-in advantage here for the administration and for the Attorney General because Congress isn't even in session. Members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, not here in Washington. They are scattered across the country in their districts because of the holidays going on this week. Some of them are even overseas. So they really do feel as though they're kind of caught back on their heels, and that also gives President Trump potentially an unfair advantage in messaging what we're about to learn.
Yeah, I know there's been complaints from Democrats who are not happy about this news conference that's about to begin.
That's absolutely right. Oh.
All right, there we see the Attorney General now approaching the podium, and we will learn more about what we will perhaps later see in that report. Here's the Attorney General.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here this morning. As you know, on March 22nd, Special Counsel Robert Mueller concluded his investigation into matters related to Russian attempts to interfere in our 2016 presidential election, and he submitted his confidential report to me pursuant to department regulations. As I said during my Senate confirmation hearing and since, I'm committed to ensuring the greatest degree possible of transparency concerning the special counsel's investigation, consistent with the law. At 11 this morning, I'm going to transmit copies of the public version of the special counsel's report to the chairman and ranking members of the Senate and House Judiciary Committees. The Department of Justice will also make the report available to the American people by posting it on the department's website after it has been delivered to Congress. I'd like to make a few comments today on the report. Before I do that, I want to thank Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein for joining me here today and for his assistance and counsel throughout this process. Rod, as you know, has served at the department for nearly 30 years with dedication and distinction, and it's been a great privilege and pleasure for me to work with him since my confirmation. He had well-deserved plans to step back from public service that were interrupted by my asking him to help in my transition. Rod has been an invaluable partner, and I am grateful that he is willing to help me and has been able to see the special counsel's investigation through to its conclusion. Thanks, Rod. Thank you. Yeah. I'd also like to thank Special Counsel Robert Mueller for his service and the thoroughness of his investigation, particularly his work exposing the nature of Russia's attempts to interfere in our electoral process. As you know, one of the primary purposes of the Special Counsel's investigation was to determine whether President Trump's campaign or any individual associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election. Volume 1 of the Special Counsel's report describes the results of that investigation. As you will see, the Special Counsel's report states that his, quote, investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. I am sure that all Americans share my concern about the efforts of the Russian government to interfere in our presidential election. As the Special Counsel report makes clear, the Russian government sought to interfere in our election process. But thanks to the Special Counsel's thorough investigation, we now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign, or the knowing assistance of any other American for that matter. That is something that all Americans can and should be grateful to have confirmed. The Special Counsel report outlines two main efforts by the Russian government to influence the 2016 election. First, the report details efforts by the Internet Research Agency, a Russian company with close ties to the Russian government, to sow social discord among American voters through disinformation and social media operations. Following a thorough investigation of this disinformation campaign, the Special Counsel brought charges in federal court against several Russian nationals and entities for their respective roles in this scheme. Those charges remain pending, and the individual defendants remain at large. But the Special Counsel found no evidence that any American, including anyone associated with the Trump campaign, conspired or coordinated with the Russian government or the IRA in this illegal scheme. Indeed, as the report states, quote, the investigation did not identify evidence that any U.S. person knowingly or intentionally coordinated with the IRA's interference operation, unquote. Put another way, the Special Counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities. Second, the report details efforts by the Russian military officials associated with the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Organization, to hack into computers and steal documents and emails from individuals associated with the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton's campaign for the purpose of eventually publicizing these documents. Obtaining such unauthorized access into computers is a federal crime. Following a thorough investigation of these hacking operations, the Special Counsel brought charges in federal court against several Russian military officers for their respective roles in these illegal hacking operations. Those charges are still pending, and the defendants remain at large. But again, the Special Counsel's report did not find any evidence that members of the Trump campaign or anyone associated with the campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these hacking operations. In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking. The Special Counsel's investigation also examined Russian efforts to publish stolen emails and documents on the Internet. The Special Counsel found that after the GRU disseminated some of the stolen documents to entities that it controlled, DC Leaks and Guccifer 2, the GRU transferred some of the stolen materials to WikiLeaks for publication. WikiLeaks then made a series of document dumps. The Special Counsel also investigated whether any member or affiliate of the Trump campaign encouraged or otherwise played a role in these dissemination efforts. Under applicable law, publication of these types of material would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. Here, too, the special counsel's report did not find that any person associated with the Trump campaign illegally participated in the dissemination of the materials. Finally, the special counsel investigated a number of links or contacts between the Trump campaign officials and individuals connected with the Russian government during the 2016 presidential campaign. After reviewing these contacts, the special counsel did not find any conspiracy to violate U.S. law involving Russian-linked persons and any persons associated with the Trump campaign. So that's the bottom line. After nearly 2 years of investigation, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of warrants, and witness interviews, the special counsel confirmed that the Russian government sponsored efforts to illegally interfere with the 2016 presidential election, but did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts. After finding no underlying collusion with Russia, the special counsel's report goes on to consider whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction of the special counsel's investigation. As I addressed in my March 24th letter, the special counsel did not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment regarding this allegation. Instead, the report recounts 10 episodes involving the president and discusses potential legal theories for connecting those activities to the elements of an obstruction offense. After carefully reviewing the facts and legal theories outlined in the report, and in consultation with the Office of Legal Counsel and other department lawyers, the Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision. Instead, we accepted the special counsel's legal framework for purposes of our analysis and evaluated the evidence as presented by the special counsel in reaching our conclusions. In assessing the president's actions discussed in the report, it is important to bear in mind the context. President Trump faced an unprecedented situation. As he entered into office and sought to perform his responsibilities as president, federal agents and prosecutors were scrutinizing his conduct before and after taking office and the conduct of some of his associates. At the same time, there was relentless speculation in the news media about the president's personal culpability. Yet, as he said from the beginning, there was in fact no collusion. And as the special counsel's report acknowledges, there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by his sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by his political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks. Nonetheless, the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation, providing unfettered access to campaign and White House documents, directing senior aides to testify freely, and asserting no privilege claims. And at the same time, the president took no act that in fact deprived the special counsel of the documents and witnesses necessary to complete his investigation. Apart from whether the acts were obstructive, this evidence of non-corrupt motives weighs heavily against any allegation that the president had a corrupt intent to obstruct the investigation. Now, before I take questions, I want to address a few aspects of the process for producing the public report that I am releasing today. As I said several times, the report contains limited redactions related to 4 categories of information. To ensure as much transparency as possible, those redactions have been clearly labeled so that the readers can tell which redactions correspond to which categories. Now, as to recall, those categories are 6E material, grand jury material, information that the IC believes would disclose sources and methods, information that would impair the investigation and prosecution of other cases that are underway, and finally, information that implicates the privacy and reputational interests of peripheral third parties. As you will see, most of the redactions were compelled by the need to prevent harm to ongoing matters and to comply with court orders prohibiting the public disclosure of information bearing on ongoing investigations and criminal cases, such as the IRA case and the Roger Stone case. These redactions were applied by Department of Justice attorneys working closely together with attorneys from the Special Counsel's office, as well as the intelligence community, and prosecutors are handling the ongoing cases. The redactions are their work product. No redactions done by anybody outside this group. There were no redactions done by anybody outside this group. No one outside this group proposed any redactions, and no one outside the department has seen the unredacted report, with the exception of certain sections that were made available to IC, the intelligence community, for their advice on protecting intelligence sources and methods. Consistent with longstanding executive branch practice, the decision whether to assert executive privilege over any portion of the report rested with the President of the United States. Because the White House had voluntarily cooperated with the Special Counsel, significant portions of the report contained material over which the President could have asserted privilege, and he would have been well within his rights to do so. Following my March 29th letter, the Office of the White House Counsel requested the opportunity to review the redacted version of the report in order to advise the President on the potential invocation of privilege, which is consistent with longstanding practice. Following that review, the President confirmed that in the interest of transparency and full disclosure to the American people, he would not assert privilege over the Special Counsel's report. Accordingly, the public report I am releasing today contains redactions only for the 4 categories that I previously outlined, and no material has been redacted based on executive privilege. In addition, earlier this week, the President's personal counsel requested and was given the opportunity to read a final version of the redacted report before it was publicly released. That request was consistent with the practice followed under the Ethics in Government Act, which permitted individuals named in a report prepared by an independent counsel the opportunity to read the report before publication. The President's personal lawyers were not permitted to make and did not request any redactions. In addition to making the redacted report public, we are also working with Congress to accommodate their legitimate oversight interests with respect to the Special Counsel's investigation. We have been consulting with Chairman Graham and Chairman Nadler through this process, and we will continue to do so. Given the limited nature of the redactions, I believe that the publicly released report will allow every American to understand the results of the Special Counsel's investigation. Nevertheless, in an effort to accommodate congressional requests, we will make available, subject to appropriate safeguards, to a bipartisan group of leaders from several congressional committees, a version of the report with all redactions removed, except those relating to grand jury information. Thus, these members of Congress will be able to see all of the redacted material for themselves, with the limited exception of that which, by law, cannot be shared. I believe that this accommodation, together with my upcoming testimony before the Senate and House Judiciary Committees, will satisfy any need Congress has for information regarding the Special Counsel's investigation. Once again, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I will now have a few questions.
Mr. Attorney General, we don't have the report in hand, so could you explain for us the Special Counsel's articulated reason for not reaching a decision on obstruction of justice, and if it had anything to do with the department's long-standing guidance on not indicting a sitting president? And you say you disagreed with some of his legal theories. What did you disagree with him on?
I'd leave it to his description in the report, the special counsel's own articulation of why he did not want to make a determination as to whether or not there was an obstruction offense. But I will say that when we met with him, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein and I met with him along with Ed O'Callahan, who is the principal associate deputy. On March 5th, we specifically asked him about the OLC opinion and whether or not he was taking the position that he would have found a crime but for the existence of the OLC opinion. And he made it very clear several times that that was not his position. He was not saying that but for the OLC opinion he would have found a crime. He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
Did you disagree with him on?
May I follow up on that, Mr. Attorney General?
What did you disagree with him on?
Given that, why did you and Mr. Rosenstein feel the need you had to take it to the next step to conclude that there was no crime, especially given that DOJ policy?
Well, the very prosecutorial function and all our powers as prosecutors, including the power to convene grand juries and the compulsory process that's involved there, is for one purpose and one purpose only. It's determine yes or no. Was alleged conduct criminal or not criminal? That is our responsibility, and that's why we have the tools we have. And we don't go through this process just to collect information and throw it out to the public. We collect this information, we use that compulsory process for the purpose of making that decision. And because the special counsel did not make that decision, we felt the department had to, and that was a decision by me and the Deputy Attorney General. Yes.
Or did the special counsel indicate that he wanted you to make the decision or that it should be left for Congress? And also, how do you respond to criticism you're receiving from congressional Democrats that you're acting more as an attorney for the president rather than as the chief law enforcement officer?
Well, Special Counsel Mueller did not indicate that his purpose was to leave the decision to Congress. I hope that was not his view, since we don't convene grand juries and conduct criminal investigations for that purpose. He did not. I didn't talk to him directly about the fact that we were making the decision, but I am told that his reaction to that was that it was my prerogative as Attorney General to make that decision.
Attorney General Barr, Catherine Herridge, Fox News. Hi there. Is there anything you can share today about your review of the genesis of the Russia investigation and whether assets have been provided to investigate?
No, today I'm really focused just on the process of releasing this report.
Attorney General, senior Democrats in Congress have asked for Robert Mueller himself to testify. Robert Mueller remains a Justice Department employee as of this moment. Will you permit him to testify publicly to Congress?
I have no objection to Bob Mueller personally testifying.
Mr. Attorney General, it's not just Democrats who have questioned some of the process here. A Republican-appointed judge on Tuesday said you have, quote, created an environment that has caused a significant part of the American public to be concerned about these redactions. You've cleared the president on obstruction. The president is fundraising off of your comments about spying. And here you have remarks that are quite generous to the president, including acknowledging his feelings and his emotions. So what do you say to people on both sides of the aisle who are concerned that you are trying to protect the president?
Well, actually, the statements about his sincere beliefs are recognized in the report, that there was substantial evidence for that. So I'm not sure what your basis is for saying that I'm being generous to the president.
You face an unprecedented situation. It just seems like there's a lot of effort to go out of your way to acknowledge how this.
Well, is there another precedent for it?
No, but it's unusual.
Okay, so unprecedented is an accurate description, isn't it?
Yes. But
okay.
What do you say to people who are concerned that you're trying to protect the president?
Eric?
There's a lot of public interest in the absence of the special counsel and members of his team. Was he invited to join you up on the podium? Why is he not here? This is his report, obviously, that you're talking about today.
No, it's not. It's a report he did for me as the Attorney General. He is required under the regulation to provide me with a confidential report. I'm here to discuss my response to that report and my decision, entirely discretionary, to make it public, since these reports are not supposed to be made public. That's what I'm here to discuss.
Impropriety for you to come out and sort of what appears to be sort of spinning the report before the public gets a chance to read it?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We've been listening to the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, issue some conclusions describing to a certain extent the content of the Molar Report, which we now expect to see in a matter of minutes or hours. The 400-page document will be released. He described the conclusions thereof and in remarkable terms talked about the substance of it, saying there was no collusion and no conspiracy, and actually asserted, as a matter of fact, that no one in the Trump campaign coordinated with any member, any Russian official in order to meddle with our election. Quite extraordinary comments. And then on the issue of obstruction.
Yeah, well, first of all, he says, confirm that there was no obstruction. The words we've heard the president and his folks use before. But there was this issue where William Barr seems to be coming to the defense of the president. And you heard that with one of the last questions by reporters when he says the president faced an unprecedented situation. There was substantial evidence to show the president was frustrated and angered by a sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency. Now, you heard Barr defend that and say he's referring to the special counsel's investigation. But I think we're going to be hearing a lot about that particular issue.
Yeah, a couple housekeeping things. He says the White House lawyers and the president's personal lawyer were both given an opportunity to view the redacted, that is partially blacked out version of the report prior to its public release, which happens later today. He also said he will afford members of Congress the chance to see the actual report without redactions in a quite limited setting. But as we turn to some of the experts we have on our panel here, I turn to you, Matt Miller. You were a spokesperson for the Department of Justice for many, many years. You've heard many, many news conferences like this, and I saw your eyebrows were raised when we really did hear the Attorney General, who's independent, chief law enforcement officer of this country, reach out and make some very strong factual assertions that are quite beneficial to the president.
I really thought it was an astonishing performance by the Attorney General. I've never seen an Attorney General, a U.S. attorney, any prosecutor from the Department of Justice give a performance like that, where he really sounded more like the president's defense attorney. There were two things that I thought were really remarkable. One, this point that you raised, where he said, we now know, basically, that collusion doesn't happen. That's not what the Department of Justice says when it ends investigations. It might say we didn't establish that a crime was committed, but to actually say we know that a crime didn't happen is not the way DOJ usually talks about in investigations, and it was an unusual thing for him to do. The second thing is for the Attorney General basically to come out and excuse the president's 2-year-long assault on the Department of Justice when he said he faced an unprecedented situation when he took office. He was under investigation. His associates were under investigation. Those associates, many of them, have now gone to jail as a result of that investigation. For him to make excuses for the president, it would be one thing for him to come out, as he said previously, and say, I've made the determination that the president's actions don't constitute a crime. But for him to actually excuse the president firing the FBI director, asking the FBI director to back off of a lawfully predicated investigation, to attack the department publicly and privately, I thought really was an astonishing thing for the chief law enforcement officer of the United States.
Well, I want to bring in Danny Savalas to get the legal view. As I mentioned, though, that we are waiting now to see the report. That's going to looks like it'll probably occur sometime after 11 o'clock that we'll get our first look at the report. But Danny, on the issue of obstruction of justice, his thinking as to why it became his responsibility after the special counsel deferred on the issue of obstruction, was it a sound legal argument as to why William Barr would make that determination?
Barr appears to have made that determination because, and he gave a brief speech about it, as a prosecutor, it's their duty to make a final determination. And if you read between the lines, you could see a subtle jab at Robert Mueller for simply amassing the facts and leaving that final duty to the Attorney General to make the determination based on this collection of facts, because Barr views it as the obligation of a prosecutor. Prosecutors, as he said, don't just amass facts and put them out there for the public to digest. Prosecutors make decisions, prosecutorial decisions.
Pete Williams, though, our justice correspondent who posed the question, pointed out that this is not just any would-be defendant. This is the President of the United States who could not be charged under the guidelines that the Department of Justice abides by. So was it, in fact, necessary in this particular and unique instance for the Attorney General to come in and render this legal judgment when Robert Mueller chose not to?
That's exactly right. The President is the one person, possibly in the world, for which different rules apply. Because if he cannot be prosecuted because of that OLC opinion, then maybe it is relevant for the public to know what facts were amassed about him and what conclusions were drawn. Those are critical because, especially if you believe in the unitary executive theory, the president is the one person that if you arrest him, you arrest the entire executive branch. And it's for that reason and some other reasons that there's that longstanding principle that a sitting president cannot be indicted.
Let's bring in Chuck Todd to this. Chuck, have you been watching the last half hour? It seems the takeaway would be a clean bill of health for President Trump.
Well, I mean, Bill Barr did, I think, went even further than many of his critics or even his supporters thought he might do this morning. But I do think it's worth noting, and I'm curious of our legal minds up there, including you, Savannah, what you made of some very carefully worded ways that he said certain things. I thought the WikiLeaks portion of this was fascinating when he said this. It was the idea. The special counsel also investigated whether any member or affiliate of the Trump campaign encouraged or otherwise played a role in these dissemination efforts, meaning putting the emails out there. And he says this: under applicable law, publication of these types of materials would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. It leaves open this idea that somebody helped with the sorting of the emails, somebody helped WikiLeaks with this, but they couldn't prove that the person who helped necessarily was part of the original hacking in there. I thought that was interesting, and obviously you guys have been digging into the very careful way he has worded their decision on obstruction, which the more you read his details, it does seem as if they were essentially saying only the president, in this case, would you not be bringing charges against?
Well, I thought that he actually put that whole issue aside. It seems like he's trying to say this whole question of whether or not a sitting president can be indicted, let's take that off the table. I thought William Barr went very far in trying to establish the factual innocence under an obstruction statute, saying essentially that the president did not possess the requisite mental state, and that is why he used those words that, in the one reporter's terms, seemed so generous to the president's frame of mind. I think, Matt, he was trying to say, look, he cooperated with the special counsel investigation. He may have felt frustrated by it, but his actions spoke to his cooperation. And so how can I bring, as a prosecutor, an obstruction case that requires a criminal intent, a corrupt intent, when I have these facts before me? So he framed it in that way to explain his decision. But to your point, it sure comes across as though he's quite sympathetic to the president.
That's right. And I think those remarks all, to me, felt like he was preempting what we're going to read later today. He noted that there were 10 acts of potential obstruction that the special counsel examined. And then he said that he and the deputy attorney general disagreed with some of Bob Mueller's reasoning. And that tells me what he was trying to accomplish today is to put out this narrative before we read the report that the Justice Department, as constituted by himself and the Deputy Attorney General, don't agree with what you're going to read later today. We don't agree that these acts might have been obstruction of justice. And I think so he's both taking off the table the idea that the president can be indicted and kind of trying to preempt any conclusion that Congress might reach when it makes its own factual determination about whether the president's actions constitute an act that merits impeachment.
Well, the president and his team have been waiting for this and been prepared with their rebuttal to it, and it may have come in the first tweet from the president since that news conference. Let's go to Hallie Jackson now. Hallie, tell us what you're seeing.
Well, the president clearly liked what he saw from the attorney general. As we were watching it, I couldn't help but think that the president must be thrilled, and it appears he is. He is tweeting now a riff off the popular television show Game of Thrones, writing simply "Game Over." And in the font in the top left of your screen there, he writes, "No collusion, no obstruction. For the haters and the radical left Democrats, game over." This is the president's pre-report release victory lap, if you will. His administration is clearly trying to set what they believe is the narrative for this, even before anybody, as you all have noted here, has had the chance to see the contents of the report itself. And there's a couple of things to note from this news conference here. First, this critical piece of information that the White House counsel's office asked to review the redacted report for reasons of potential executive privilege. And then, according to Bill Barr, the president decided not to assert privilege. There's another piece of this, though, which is that the president's outside attorneys, Jay Sekulow, Rudy Giuliani, and others, at some point earlier this week, also asked to review the redacted copy, and the Department of Justice said yes. The Attorney General says that is based on precedent. He had reasons to allow that and said that the president's outside legal team did not request any redactions, nor, by the way, would they have been allowed to do so. That said, this is a political landmine, given that almost undoubtedly you will hear some in Congress infuriated that the president's outside attorneys had a chance to see this report before they had a chance to review it upon its release to the public. There's also a piece of this on the protection of the president here. Savannah noted that a question to the Attorney General related to the idea that he seemed to be generous to the president. He repeated this very specific phrase, no collusion, several times. That cannot be a coincidence. That is a phrase that we have heard from the president repeatedly, again and again. Keep in mind the word collusion. There's no crime of collusion, right? The crime would be, for example, conspiracy to undermine the United States national security. But Barr specifically used that phrase multiple times, which I think is what led to some of these questions and some of this criticism about whether the Attorney General is acting more like a defense attorney, if you will, for the president, rather than the Attorney General of the United States. The Attorney General had the opportunity to answer that question a couple of times, and he did not. He instead went after the questioner and the way that the question was framed, rather than, for example, asserting his independence from the president. So I think there is a lot to unpack from what we just heard from the Attorney General. And remember, all of it happening before anybody has had a chance to see any more than 75 words from this special counsel report.
And that, Hallie, I think is the important thing we need to keep reminding our viewers. We're working a little bit in the dark here. We have not seen the report. It has not been released to the public yet or to Congress. So we can only take William Barr at face value.
That said, he gave us a lot to chew on, didn't he? I want to go to Chuck Rosenberg, who, of course, has been a very experienced member of the Department of Justice for many, many years. What did you think of what Bill Barr said and did today?
Well, Savannah, I think you made a really important point earlier when you talked about the level of intent that's required to show that someone committed a crime such as obstruction. So Bill Barr explained today that the president, and I thought this wording was odd, had a sincere belief that his presidency was being undermined by political opponents. Now, in order to have a sincere belief, you'd have to have evidence that he had a sincere belief, and perhaps the best way to do that would be to talk to the president. But we're pretty sure that never happened. And so one lingering question for me regarding intent, Savannah, is how do you determine someone has a sincere belief that something happened when you never had a chance to interview that person? That troubles me. That's why I want to see the report. Book reviews are interesting, but the book is always more telling.
Well, the book is coming in a matter of minutes, Chuck, but it is interesting when you really drill down and look at what he said on this issue of obstruction and the president's state of mind. He did include facts favorable to the president's state of mind and what he called facing an unprecedented situation, that his conduct was scrutinized, there was relentless speculation. He did not include, in the interest of completeness, the other facts that are not as favorable as to his conduct. Did that catch your attention?
It did. So when we, as baby prosecutors, are trained, one thing we are trained to do in opening statements to a jury during a trial is draw the sting. We front any weaknesses in our case to the jury. It's an appropriate thing to do because you want to tell the jury in your own words what in your case is lacking and not leave that to a defense attorney to do that in her opening statement. What Barr seemed to be doing today is drawing the sting, but in the opposite way. He was talking about all the things that favored the president and didn't provide to the press or to the public anything that disfavored the president. And so it didn't seem to me to be a straight ahead, fair recitation of what we're going to see and read later today. He was drawing the sting for the president, and that troubles me.
And Chuck, let's look ahead here. We're using the term he was generous toward the president. Were any of the statements he's made, will they provide a defense or some cushion for President Trump vis-a-vis what's happening in the Southern District of New York, those cases that are still going forward?
Perhaps politically, Lester, but no, not legally. In the end, prosecutors are governed by facts and law. And so Mr. Barr's characterization of what the president did or thought or felt or believed really doesn't matter very much. And to the extent that the ongoing cases in the Southern District of New York, and I continue to maintain, by the way, that that is really important stuff for us to keep our eye on. Those cases will run their own course based on their own facts and the law that applies to those facts, and not on anybody's characterization of them.
Chuck Rosenberg, thank you very much. Savannah, we're going to have a busy day here. We have not seen the report, but we are going to see it today, we have been assured, and will obviously be 400 pages. We will have teams in place going through that, and we'll come back on the air. That's going to wrap up our coverage for this hour for right now, but there is much more at NBCnews.com and on MSNBC.
And of course, we will, as Lester said, be right back on the air with more live as soon as the Mueller report is released and publicized. It'll be on NBCnews.com. Most of you will return to today. This has been an NBC News special report.
Haters and the radical left Democrats, game over. Nicole, that's your president.
Yeah, well, and I've got something from his network, who I don't think falls into the category of haters or the media that he. So this is from Fox News. This is Chris Wallace on Fox News watching the same live event that you and I just did. Chris Wallace on Fox News said this, quote, "The Attorney General seemed almost to be acting as the counselor for the defense, the counselor for the president, rather than the Attorney General, talking about his motives, his emotions, really, as I say, making a case for the president." That's Fox News's analysis. So I don't know, how involved the president gets in the subtitles on the it looked like a copyright infringement. I'm not a Game of Thrones geek. But, I think the idea that they are going to try to bully the analysts is so Trumpian. And I think you go back to Donald Trump standing at a podium and saying, don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears. I mean, you take all the dystopian sort of elements of the Trump presidency and you sometimes wonder, alone in a cab, am I nuts or is this really what I'm seeing? They don't want you to believe your eyes and ears. But what just happened was plain as day. The country's Attorney General is now, in the words of Fox News's chief political anchor, Chris Wallace, functioning as Donald Trump's defense attorney.
And it's not just stop believing eyes and ears. There's a misdirection going on. I mean, just imagine if you were a neutral attorney general, any attorney general that I've ever known in the past, and they had the responsibility today of giving the press conference, if you had a report that said the Russians interfered with our election, don't you think you would have said something about what Donald Trump said about that it wasn't Russia, it might have been a 400-pound guy. He also tweeted once the Mueller probe should never have been started, and there was no collusion and there was no crime. Trump was wrong about those things. That's what the Mueller report after 22 months said, and the Attorney General never said a word about that.
And Neil, since when do we talk about the feelings and emotions of the subject of an investigation the day the report is issued?
Yeah, not just the day of, but just imagine a prosecutor. If a prosecutor went and said, oh, that defendant I'm investigating, or that FBI agent you're investigating, they seem frustrated. I don't think that you should bring criminal charges. That would be ridiculous. I can't imagine something more demoralizing for the prosecutors at the Justice Department today than to have this Attorney General make excuse after excuse for what happened.
Especially when Robert Mueller didn't get a chance to evaluate the president's state of mind, because Robert Mueller never got to interview the president, and the president didn't even respond to written questions about the obstruction investigation. So what did Barr know about the president's state of mind that Robert Mueller never had access to? And how did he know it?
What's going on behind the scenes right now? We have this interregnum for 45 more minutes. Before members of Congress are allowed, and of course the members of the public are allowed to see the CD-ROM of this report.
Well, I feel like it's just like theater going on. I mean, there is no reason whatsoever why the report shouldn't have been given first before the Barr press conference, except so that Barr could get out his talking points and try and influence the direction of the country first ahead of time and get out ahead of the story. So I suspect what's going on now is just a long twiddling the thumbs and waiting period. It's not like they're redacting right now. They're done.
I think that's too cerebral. I mean, I think the president is there making judgments about, whose nose was properly powdered. I mean, the president views the entire presidency as a TV show. And when you bomb in the view of Chris Wallace on Fox News, when you've somehow gone so far that when the president, who's probably watching all this on Fox News, gets a negative review, that's how the president processes every event of his presidency, how Fox News and how the media sees it. And I think the president had to have loved what he saw out of AG Barr. But I imagine the president's frustrated that even Fox News wasn't buying all that spin.
And as I say, after a long career in the law, the Attorney General will have to reconcile himself to the fact that this will be how his reputation is set in legal history. Again, at the age of 68, he made clear at his confirmation hearing he was looking forward to a life of leisure and a life of retirement, and he wasn't looking to get back in the game, did not seek this job Others have disagreed with that, with the unsolicited memo he submitted on the scope of presidential power. We're looking forward to talking to our two folks who were inside that news conference, and that's Pete Williams and Julia Ainsley, to get some of the flavor of that event. You'll note hardly every question was answered, especially some of the more negative questions. The AG brushed past those. Our own Carol Lee continues to watch and listen. Carol?
Yeah, Brian, look, I think that there's no other way to say this. The Attorney General went in, made a conscious decision that he was not going to let this report speak for itself. And I think Nicole makes a really important point in that, you know, there is a question of whether he went too far. If everything he said is true, then would it have been more beneficial for him to let the report come out and then say what he had to say? I mean, if you look at the things that he said more than a dozen times in one way or another that there was no collusion. You know, he went through and defended the president in ways that I'm guessing the White House probably didn't even think that he would go so far to defend him, particularly on the obstruction piece of things. And he didn't leave a lot of wiggle room in terms of, you know, things that we may come to learn. He almost sort of presented it as a fait accompli that there wasn't going to be anything that would be worth digging through in this report. And yet there's one thing, and Jeremy Bash touched on this a little bit earlier, that he did kind of leave this breadcrumb out there that I'm curious about. I'll be curious to see what the report actually says, and that's when it comes to the WikiLeaks information and whether or not there was any sort of effort by the Trump individuals in the Trump's orbit to work with them on the dissemination of that information. He said that, you know, there was no one who illegally participated. And that seemed to be the only part of everything that he said that left open possibility that we will read this report and see something in there that perhaps isn't seen as an entire vindication of the president's team in terms of no collusion. But he specifically said there was nothing illegally happening there.
Carol Lee, thank you. Chuck Rosenberg, a veteran federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI official, is among the folks we'll be able to talk to today. Chuck, you recognized a tactic at work here today.
I did, Brian, and I think that's a good word for it. The tactic is something we call, as prosecutors, drawing the sting, and we use that in opening statements to a jury during trial. Prosecutors go first because we have the burden of proof, and so we tell the jury the weaknesses in our case. We also tell them the strengths, of course, but we tell them the weaknesses so that they hear it from us and not from the defense attorney when she goes next. And what struck me as odd here today is that the Attorney General drew the sting. He talked about things favorable to the president, but he didn't add that second piece. We know there's information in that report damaging to the president, particularly on obstruction. There are 10 episodes, we are told. Yet the Attorney General only talked about stuff favorable to the president. And that struck me as odd, and it did strike me as a tactic, and it means that we have to read the book. Right? Book reviews may be informative, but the book is where it's at. And so we need to see what Mueller said, not the characterization of what Mueller said by the Attorney General. That was a tactic. He did employ it. It's disappointing to me, but it's not terribly surprising.
I was just going to say, are you surprised at this? Are you? And let me take another swing at that. Are you surprised, given his body of work and his life in the law and what heretofore was his reputation?
I am, and I mentioned this on Nicole's show the other day. I started off believing that Bill Barr was a principled institutionalist, and I've said that many times in many places. And over the past several weeks, sadly, I've seen data coming over the transom to suggest that he is not what I thought him to be. I think there's still hope, a chance, maybe, perhaps, that he is the Bill Barr we knew from the Department of Justice 30 years ago. But what he seems to be doing, and it was particularly troublesome when he talked about the quote-unquote spying by the FBI, which is just a ludicrous term to use to describe court-authorized surveillance, that Barr has gone too far into the tank for the President of the United States. So I am disappointed, I am chagrined, and I frankly, like I am many times in my life, Brian, may just be flat out wrong about Bill Barr being a principled institutionalist.
Chuck Rosenberg, we had that conversation, and your words have haunted me ever since. And we are now in a position of covering the two big stories, the evolution or devolution of William Barr as our country's Attorney General. And for the very first time, we're about to see 10 instances of what Robert Mueller examined as obstruction of justice. They talked about seeing evidence on both sides. Do you deduce from what you've heard at this point that they built their obstruction case and that will be in the obstruction report? And could you imagine any sort of case law being cited? I mean, do you imagine they argued for or tried to bring an obstruction case? What do you think we'll see?
Well, I imagine we're going to see a pretty compelling pattern of obstructive conduct. If Mueller looked at 10 episodes, and if it includes stuff we don't know about, and the stuff we already do know about is fairly compelling, I imagine there's a strong case for obstruction. I will say this, and we've been hinting at it. In order to determine that the President had a sincere belief, Nicole, you are spot on about this, in order to determine that the President had a sincere belief that his presidency was being undermined by political opponents and that he was frustrated and angry, wouldn't you need to talk to him? And so to characterize it that way to me is troubling. And I would love to see the Molar Report, the actual book and not the book review, to make that determination for myself.
What do you think we'll see, Chuck, in terms of explaining the non-conclusion? I mean, no mention really from William Barr about the way the obstruction investigation ended. It did not end the way Barr says it ended. I mean, he changed the ending like an unsuccessful pilot. It did not end in exoneration. It did not end in a declination letter. It ended in a special counsel version of a hung jury.
Yeah, which seems kind of unfulfilling and unappealing. I mean, I always thought, Nicole, that the reason they didn't reach a conclusion is because policy precludes charging a sitting president. And for good reason, I think. Any sitting president would be unnecessarily, perhaps improperly burdened with a stigma that attaches to criminal charges and would have difficulty defending themselves while in office. Politically, it would become untenable. And I'm not saying that because I particularly favor Mr. Trump. That just strikes me as sound policy. But if that's the policy, then maybe it's also stigmatizing and burdensome to recommend charging a sitting president. And so that's always been my working theory about why the Mueller team came up a step short in its recommendation. I am very anxious to read that part of the report.
Hey, Chuck, we did hear the Attorney General say that he thought it would be fine if Mueller testified. Did Mueller need his approval at all? We were kind of operating under the assumption that Mueller would go ahead and appear before, among others, House Judiciary.
Well, generally speaking, and by the way, I'm sure Mueller's just thrilled that Bill Barr offered him up. Nothing he'd rather do, I'm certain. But generally speaking, Brian, subordinates within the Department of Justice, and everybody is subordinate to the Attorney General, testifies essentially with the permission of the Attorney General. I mean, there's an expectation that senior officials who run agencies like FBI or ATF or DEA will testify on behalf of their agencies, but Mueller is a subordinate official, and so it's appropriate for Bill Barr to make that call. I'm glad to hear that he's going to permit it. Mueller is the straightest straight shooter I've met in my decades in the Department of Justice, and I'd like to hear what he has to say about the Mueller report.
Yeah, presumably we will find out if Mr. Mueller found these 4 mentions of no collusion in today's statement to be excessive. Neil Katyal.
Well, so what might look like a very good thing that Barr did, and it is good to say that Mueller should testify, he has no objection to Mueller testifying, is really low-hanging fruit, because I think Chuck, maybe just one slight tweak on what Chuck said, Mueller is a special counsel. He's from outside the Justice Department and indeed will be a non-Justice Department employee very soon. And that was done when we wrote the regulations for a very important reason, the kind of fail-safe break glass thing is if the Attorney General is preventing the special counsel from providing the truth to the American people. We went and picked someone from outside the department to be the special counsel for exactly that reason, so that they're outside the chain of command and could testify. So Barr knows that. Barr knows there is no way to stop Mueller from testifying because he won't be a Justice Department employee. So he gave that up, but he's not giving up very much.
And to Chuck's point, we know how much Mueller loves public appearances.
Exactly.
Joyce Vance is watching along with us, as she has for these prior 22 months, former U.S. attorney, these days a professor at the University of Alabama Law School. Joyce, we have yet to get you on the record what we just witnessed at the Department of Justice.
It was a very sobering press conference for people who've watched attorney generals talk about serious cases. This felt a lot like we heard President Trump's defense lawyer explaining Mueller's case to us. It did not feel like a sitting attorney general, and as I wrote notes, made notes of what Barr was saying, I reached a point where I just wrote down, Barr continues to shill for the president, because it felt like that was exactly what was going on. He talked about how fluidly the White House had cooperated with Mueller, and he listed documents and the availability of senior witnesses without ever commenting on the fact that the President of the United States refused to present himself for an interview with the special counsel despite repeated requests. You know, that's not cooperation, that's just spin from Barr. And at the end of the press conference, in response to a question, Barr got a little bit indignant when he was asked about the report and made the point that Mueller wrote the report for him. And that's just not true. Mueller is there. He is in place because of conflicts inside of DOJ, which works for the president at the end of the day. This entire notion that Barr is now somehow supplanting Mueller's independent role, I think characterizes what we saw this morning perfectly.
Yeah, Joyce, it's already been mentioned around here, though it would harken back to a conflict decades ago. We would not be surprised if some headline writer somewhere came up with Baghdad Bill Barr for what we saw today. I'm going to read you 4 different quotes. Put another way, the special counsel found no collusion by any Americans. Quote 2, in other words, there was no evidence of Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government hacking. Quote 3, after finding no underlying collusion with Russia, the special counsel's report goes on to consider whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction. And quote 4, yet as he, Donald Trump, said from the beginning, there was in fact no collusion. You and others have pointed out this word collusion is not a term in the law.
It's not a term in the law, but it's clear that as the Attorney General, Bill Barr knows how to speak the president's language and is speaking perhaps to an audience larger than an audience of one, but this certainly resonates with the president. It's very difficult to see an Attorney General doing this. And you know, so many of us had hoped that once Bill Barr returned to that building on Pennsylvania Avenue, he would feel gravitational pull inside of DOJ and do the right thing. But during the confirmation process, I wrote a piece for Slate and pointed out that because he had written this 19-page audition letter to get the president to hire him, the people of the United States would probably lack confidence in his outcome, and that seemed to be disqualifying for him as an attorney general. I think that that's even more true today. Instead of bringing this episode to a close, Barr's participation will in many ways make people less certain about this outcome, and it is a sad day for all of us. Yeah,
it's been said before, the questions are out there whether or not he views the president as his client or the people of the United States of America. Joyce, thank you. We did hear, and Ari Melber was among those highlighting this, the portion of Barr's presentation about obstruction. The natural question is, how can you prove or disprove obstruction if you didn't have an in-person interview with the president? Here, nonetheless, is that portion.
After finding no underlying collusion with Russia, the special counsel's report goes on to consider whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction of the special counsel's investigation. As I addressed in my March 24th letter, the special counsel did not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment regarding this allegation. Instead, the report recounts 10 episodes involving the president and discusses potential legal theories for connecting those activities to the elements of an obstruction offense. After carefully reviewing the facts and legal theories outlined in the report, and in consultation with the Office of Legal Counsel and other department lawyers, the Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision.
Again, so notable there that there was disagreement. If you look at Rosenstein and Barr as Team A, disagreement with the legal theories settled upon by Robert Mueller. Andrea Mitchell, watching and listening with us. Andrea?
Well, I was so struck by that because what the Attorney General seems to be saying and going out of his way is to say that there was no intent. And how do we know there was no intent without an interview? It seems to me that the White House lawyers, the personal lawyers of the president, were brilliant in one regard in particular in demanding that there be no interview and that they only submit written answers to questions, because there's no way that Mueller could follow up and try to determine the intent. And to say that there was no intent based on what the Attorney General says were extraordinary, unprecedented circumstances, the context, and then to go out of his way, as though he were a defense lawyer, to explain the pressure that the president was under coming into office with all of the allegations against him regarding Russia and alleged conspiracy or collusion, if you will. That is not his role. If you even compare it to what James Comey did in that highly criticized presentation against Hillary Clinton, he did not talk about her state of mind. He did not talk about her intent. He just said that she was extraordinarily careless and that he then decided that there was not basis to prosecute. Here, the Attorney General is going well beyond that even in clearing the president. And I think that this is, as Chuck Rosenberg said, going to be a real black mark on his long and previously distinguished career, because he has gone way outside the bounds of what the Attorney General should have been presenting, even if you concede that he should have pre-butted or preempted the report before having this news conference, which I think was extraordinary and really objectionable. Already you see demands for Robert Mueller to testify. Nadler has made that demand from the House side, and Amy Klobuchar, one of the candidates and a key member of the Judiciary Committee, said that on behalf of the Senate. You won't hear that perhaps from the Senate Republican chairman, but you're certainly going to hear it from Chuck Schumer and other members of the Democrats in the Senate, that Mueller is going to have to be front and center. And you did hear Barr say he has no objection to Mueller, but he wouldn't be able to object because Mueller, as of after today, is no longer a member of the Department of Justice or an employee.
Andrea Mitchell in our Washington bureau, thanks. Frank.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. This is a unilateral camera or a full camera? Full camera. Okay, good.
Ladies and gentlemen, the warriors of the Wounded Warrior Project's Soldier Ride, D.C. Lance Corporal Zach Kowalik, United States Marine Corps. Corporal Devin Clark, United States Army. Private First Class Taylor Clinton, United States Army. Captain Patrick Nugent, United States Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Matthew Brown, United States Army. Petty Officer, First Class, Luke Peete, United States Navy. Specialist, Robert Croy, United States Army. Specialist, Luis Cantu, United States Army. Sergeant Justin Sather, United States Marine Corps. Corporal Troy Frodel, United States Marine Corps. Gunnery Sergeant Jose Morla, United States Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Jeremy Velez, United States Army. Staff Sergeant Trevor Brunel, United States Army. Sergeant First Class Jorge Avalos, United States Army. Staff Sergeant Casey Grella, United States Marine Corps. Sergeant First Class Anthony Valentino Jr., United States Army. Staff Sergeant Jody Kemper, United States Air Force. Sergeant Joseph Burke, United States Army. Petty Officer First Class Carol Bailey, United States Coast Guard. Petty Officer First Class Nez Nelson, United States Navy. Corporal Oscar De La Rosa, United States Marine Corps. Petty Officer Second Class Cynthia Hernandez, United States Navy. First Lieutenant John Fernandez, United States Army. Petty Officer, First Class, Alana Wilhelm, United States Navy. Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Pauly, United States Army. Commander Thomas Olivero, United States Navy. Lieutenant Junior Grade Jordan Lowe, United States Navy. Specialist William Matthews.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie.
Good day. We're back on the air with word that the Molar Report, the redacted Mueller Report, has now been made public. It has just been posted on the Department of Justice website.
That's right, 400 pages in length, not counting exhibits and other documents, and it is now live. It's public. We will put it on NBCnews.com, and as we go along this morning, we'll be reading it along with you. We already know the top-line legal conclusions here. Number one, there was no finding of conspiracy on the part of the Trump campaign or President Trump himself to conspire with the Russians to meddle in our elections. And we know that the Attorney General took the evidence that was provided by Robert Mueller and made a legal conclusion that there was not sufficient evidence for obstruction of justice. Earlier today, we heard from the Attorney General himself as he discussed some of the reasons for his findings. He also talked about some of the redactions, which is a fancy legal term for saying some of this report will be blacked out for a variety of reasons, ongoing investigations, classified information, grand jury material, but that he said he had sought to release as much as possible. And now the report is being released publicly, and it's also going to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and what is happening in this news conference today, William Barr laying out a very strong case of vindication for President Trump if you just base it on his words and what he talked about today. Now come the details. Finally, we will have a look inside as to what the Mueller report says to the extent that we can, with the knowledge that some of this is redacted for various reasons that have been laid out over the last several days. But we will particularly want to hone in on the whole decision not to pursue obstruction of justice charges. We understand this document will list some of the areas that would point to potentially obstruction of justice and the view from the special counsel on why he simply couldn't come to a decision.
There are a lot of open questions. As I said, we had those top-line legal conclusions. We don't know, for example, why Robert Mueller chose not to render a legal judgment. This was an investigation that went on nearly 2 years. There were 23 months, 500 search warrants, 2,300 subpoenas, several guilty pleas, trials that are stemming from this report. We will find out now what the underlying evidence is. I believe Kristen Welker is at the White House. The president's getting ready, Kristen, to have an event unrelated to this. He may make remarks on this, but what is the White House view of what they've heard so far from the Attorney General?
Well, so far you have the president essentially claiming victory. Savannah, he tweeted out game over against a Game of Thrones backdrop. And the reason for that is because you have the Attorney General Bill Barr, who held that press conference and essentially said that there was no determination of no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. There was no evidence of criminal obstruction. So from President Trump's perspective, he is going to continue to argue that that's total vindication. And the president's legal team already out saying that this is essentially a slam dunk for them. But of course, the devil is going to be in the details, because Barr also said that Mueller was looking at 10 potential examples of possible obstruction. And so I've been talking to some of the president's allies who say that's where their focus is going to be right now. Savannah, I know the president's about to start talking.
Yeah, he's making some remarks at this Wounded Warrior event. Let's listen and see if he talks about it.
Thrilled to host the Wounded Warrior Project. It's been a long relationship I've had, and the soldier ride is something very, very special. Few people could do it, including me. I hate to admit it. I hate to admit that, General, but including me. We're deeply honored to be in the presence of true American heroes I want to thank our great Vice President.
We're going to continue to listen to this event, and if he remarks anything about the Molar Report, we will certainly bring it to you. But as mentioned, the Department of Justice, at long last, has put on its website this actual report, and our reporter, our correspondent, Pete Williams, has been looking at it. I hope you're a speed reader, Pete, but what are you seeing so far?
Well, let me start out with a dramatic moment, according to the Special Counsel Report, when the president was told on May 17th that this whole process of the special investigation would be started with the appointment of Robert Mueller. I'm going to read from a portion of the report that describes that moment in the Oval Office. It says, when the president was told a special counsel had been appointed, the president slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I am..." And then he used a form of a word that begins with F. "I am effed." The president became angry and lambasted the Attorney General for his decision to recuse from the investigation, saying to Jeff Sessions, according to this summary, "How could you let this happen, Jeff? You were supposed to protect me." And then, according to this summary from Robert Mueller, he said to people in the room, "Everyone tells me if you get one of these independent counsels, it ruins your presidency. It takes years and years, and I won't be able to do anything. This is the worst thing that ever happened to me," close quote, according to the Mueller report. The president then told Sessions, according to the report, that he should resign as Attorney General. And in fact, according to the investigation, Jeff Sessions did submit a letter of resignation, but that was never accepted by the president. Now, the report goes on to say that at one point, there were press reports that then White House counsel Don McGahn was directed to fire the special counsel Robert Mueller, and that the president urged White House officials to tell McGahn to deny this. But according to what was said in this report, McGahn said he wouldn't do that, and said McGahn told officials that the media reports were accurate in stating that the president had directed McGahn to have the special counsel removed. And of course, obviously that never happened. Now, let me just give you some overall, step back from that dramatic thing a little bit and give you some overall sense of how the special counsel report is put together. I'm going to direct you to there. It's in 2 volumes, and we've been handed these 2 volumes in 3-ring binders. And I think one question that people may have is, how heavily redacted is the report? Section 2, which deals with the investigations of potential obstruction of justice, as you can see, is very lightly redacted. But the other 3-ring binder that we've been given, Section 1, does have more extensive redactions. Here, example, is a page of what one of these pages looks like. So the Section 1 part about the investigation of Russian meddling into the election has more redactions, and they relate to, in many cases, harm. They say harm to an ongoing matter. As you may recall, this is one of the categories that Attorney General William Barr had said would be used to redact some of the report that is going to the public, although he said this morning that members of Congress would be able to see that. Now, on the question of obstruction of justice, the report said that it looked at several actions by the president as potential actions of obstruction of justice, and many of them we were familiar with. The dinner with Comey, the firing of Comey, the dinner in which he asked for Comey's loyalty in January of 2017, the meeting in which he asked Comey to go easy on Flynn. The report says that the president did not know about Flynn's discussions with the Russian ambassador at the time they were made, and was only told about it when the Justice Department told the White House of what he was up to. And it also says that as they analyzed that issue as a potential obstruction of justice, just to give you an indication of the kind of thinking that Mueller says went into his decisions about whether to say actions constituted obstruction of justice, the report says that the president never connected in his mind Flynn's discussion with the Russian ambassador with what the president called, according to the report, the Russia thing. In other words, the special counsel's investigation of the president's conduct and the campaign's conduct. It also talks about the Mueller team looked at the president's request to Comey repeatedly to say that the president wasn't the subject of an FBI investigation and to lift what the president regarded as a cloud. And I should say, by the way, that the report basically accepts James Comey's versions in every instance of his interactions with the president that was memorialized in Mr. Comey's memos with the meetings with the president. It talks about another potential issue of obstruction of justice that was investigated by Mueller was the president's outreach to the intelligence community, to the director of national intelligence, the director of the NSA and the CIA about the Russia investigation, the president's rationales for firing Comey, and the president's involvement in issuing a statement, and this has been much reported and debated about the infamous June 9th, 2016 meeting in Trump Tower between Russians and senior Trump campaign officials. You'll recall that the president was involved in setting up an email about that was supposedly about adoption, and admitted the fact that the Russians had offered to provide the Trump campaign with what they called dirt on Hillary Clinton. Some other facts that were in the Mueller report is the discussion here about why they decided to leave it open about whether these actions amounted to obstruction of justice. And among the factors they considered, they said the president had the authority to fire James Comey because he's the head of the executive branch. He could do that. And some evidence, the report says, indicates that the president wanted to protect himself from an investigation of his campaign, but, the report says, the evidence does not establish that the firing was intended to cover up any kind of conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Now, a couple of other notes, and let me just then pause and catch my breath. Mueller believed that he had the authority to subpoena the president. He concluded that was a legal question about whether somebody in his position could, in fact, legally put the president to a subpoena, and concluded that he did have the legal authority to do so, but decided that the negotiations were so protracted that it would happen at a very late stage, and by then the investigation already knew enough based on what had been publicly stated. Now, there's an appendix to those two notebooks that I showed you. This appendix with that we got in our copy of the binder in it, and one of the things it has in it is the president's written answers to the questions from Mueller. And I haven't had a chance to go through that yet, but we are going to get the full copy of the written answers to the questions that the president gave him.
Pete, let me ask you, and let you catch your breath for a moment. This is amazing you're able to digest this so quickly, but let's talk about, so there's no interview with the president. They thought they had the right to subpoena and didn't. Is there any talk about how they gleaned intent or no intent?
Yes, based on his conversations with other people, his actions. They say, for example, Lester, that his actions toward the special counsel shifted after his early alarm that I read you that very dramatic account about. After he was initially told about the special counsel, he sort of laid back and let Mueller do his thing. But then, when it became clear that to the president that he himself was under investigation for obstruction of justice, the report says the president's tone changed. He began to tweet about Mueller and about his investigators to criticize the attack. That's the beginning of the infamous string of witch hunt attacks, an attack which continued all the way up apparently until today. And that's one factor that they looked at. But what they came down is they said for everything that they looked at, the president either had the authority to do it or the intent wasn't clear enough. And they hang their hat a lot on the fact that it didn't appear that he was trying to cover up some crime. In other words, having concluded that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, having concluded that the president didn't do anything wrong, they said that's a factor we have to consider. Now, there is an interesting discussion, and let me see if I can find it. There's an interesting discussion, I think, in some of the loose pages that I pulled out of there, Charlie, about the fact that they looked at whether they could charge the president with obstruction, and they can. I don't find it right here, but my recollection is that they concluded that they actually probably could charge the president with obstruction because it was not a crime that was directed at his ability to do the job or his official functions in office. So they basically say that it was not a showstopper for them. The Justice Department's longstanding policy under both Republicans and Democrats that you can't indict a sitting president. That, they say, was not a concern because they actually not only got past that constitutional problem, but decided they probably could charge the president with obstruction if they thought the evidence was there. Now, they
just
don't
so people
say
understand that, I just want to pause you right there because I don't want people to misunderstand. Sure. They're saying, we all know the Department of Justice has a rule that says you can't indict a sitting president. But what you read in the report is that the Mueller team found that was not an impediment, that if they had had the factual basis, they would have gone ahead and charged, as I understand you saying it, but they found they did not have sufficient factual basis. Is that correct?
Correct. That was, in other words, it wasn't that they thought that if he was anybody else, they could have charged him with a crime, but because he's the president, they couldn't. That was not the thinking.
Okay. I noticed, I'm looking, we're trying to read along with you, just so you can catch your breath, Pete, too. But I'm noticing that with regard to the collusion part, the conspiracy part of this report, it does say that there is not sufficient evidence to establish a crime, but it does say that there were the investigation identifies numerous links between individuals with ties to the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. But it says the evidence was not sufficient to support criminal charges. And then it gets into some of the technical legal statutes, which is, what the prosecutor is asked to do, not just to look at the facts, but also to see if there's a crime that could be established by those facts if they meet the technical aspects of the statute. We're all going to law school here today. Yep, go ahead, Pete.
Sure. Let me just back up on this section we just talked about, because I've just found the section that discusses this. It says the Department of Justice and the President's counsel have recognized that the President is subject to statutes that prohibit obstruction of justice by bribing a witness or suborning perjury, because that conduct does not implicate his constitutional authority. So, in other words, it was doubly not a showstopper for them. Not only were they aware of the Justice Department policy, but they also said they separately concluded, and the President's counsel agreed, that a president could be subject to a charge of obstruction of justice. But again, they just found that the evidence didn't meet it. Now, a couple of other little tidbits from the report that I've seen in the brief time I've had to look through it. You'll recall that there was, and this remains controversial to this day, early on in the investigation, the FBI got this dossier from a person who had done work for British intelligence, and one of the allegations in it was that there was a compromising, salacious videotape. This was the allegation that was made when the president was in a hotel room in Moscow, a conduct that involved some women. According to the report, a Russian businessman told Michael Cohen, who was then, at that time, the president's well-regarded personal lawyer, about the Moscow tapes. But this Russian businessman told the investigators that the tapes were fake, but had never told Cohen about that.
And Pete, I want to go back to something that, excuse me, William Barr said in his news conference. He says the special counsel's report acknowledges that there is evidence to show the president was frustrated by his belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks. Were those Barr's words, or were they actually referred to in this report?
That is a summary. I have to say that the way Barr described what he called the top line or bottom line conclusions of the Mueller investigation tracks very closely with what I've been able to read. His summary of what the investigation says is pretty much on point here, I think, Lester. And by the way, you come up in this report because one of the things that Mueller looked at, as I think is pretty well known, is the interview the president gave with you, in which he said that one of his motivations for firing James Comey was the Russia thing. And that was one of the factors that the independent counsel or the special counsel looked at.
All right, Pete, hang there. I know you're going to continue to read. We have the benefit of some great legal analysts at our table. We have Danny Savalos here and Neil Katyal, the former Solicitor General, acting Solicitor General of the U.S., and I know you both are looking at it. I see it on your screen. What pops out so far?
Well, Savannah, it's been 22 minutes since the report's come out, and I do think that's really important. This is a 400-page report. All Americans need to pause, read the thing, and then dissect it. There are a couple of things that stand out to me right away. Number one, Mueller goes through 10 different episodes of possible obstruction of justice. And so far, I haven't read anything that said he concluded there was nothing there, that there was no crime or anything like that. Rather, after discussing the 10 episodes, Mueller then goes through a whole explanation of why the president's legal theories are wrong. He says that they, quote, lack merit and that they're contrary to the litigating position of the Department of Justice. And so I suspect what happened here, but again, we have to read the report to figure it out, is when it comes to that key obstruction of justice investigation, Mueller couldn't resolve it one way or the other because he wanted Congress to. That's, after all, what his predecessors did. Leon Jaworski in Watergate, Ken Starr in the Lewinsky investigation.
Is it clear that he wanted Congress?
It's not clear. He doesn't say anything one way or the other. But when you're writing this report, if you're a special counsel and you know, well, what have my predecessors done? Well, they haven't resolved it, even with Nixon, where the evidence was overwhelming. And Mueller's writing against the backdrop of that history. And so he doesn't resolve it. He leaves it for Congress. And it's Barr who comes in and inserts himself into the process and flips it.
Is it possible, though, that Mueller, operating under different statutes than those other counsels, thought the Attorney General, he's leaving it for somebody to decide, it's not going to be him, operating under the statute that I believe you helped write? Is it possible he thought, no, the Attorney General should render this judgment?
No, I don't think so, because the special counsel regulations that we wrote in 1999, which governed Mueller, were actually patterned on Leon Jaworski. So I don't think that they're different. And I think if Mueller's writing this, he's going to say the most obvious precedent is what my predecessors have done.
And from a legal standpoint, 10 items of potential obstruction, does the number change the ultimate conclusion? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10?
Well, I mean, legally, I don't think it does, but I think practically it does. I mean, this is a really remarkable thing to have a sitting president have 10 different episodes of possible obstruction of justice. That just shows where the bar has moved away from past presidents.
But again, the question of intent looms large.
Absolutely. And so under an obstruction of justice investigation, you have to prove a corrupt intent. And what it looks like, and again, we're just starting to look at this, but it looks like Barr decided, well, you have to have some sort of underlying crime in order for there to be obstruction of justice. It can't simply be you obstruct something, an investigation into something unrelated that isn't itself a crime.
And we should note to folks that a lot of our pages look like this, probably not as heavily redacted as many people expected, but
I think Pete pointed out, and it certainly seems to be the case, that the first part of the report, which has to do with this issue of conspiracy and also the Russians' efforts to meddle in our election, those seem to be more redacted, which makes sense. You're more likely to see classified information, the kind of thing.
And they list them here. It says a harm to an ongoing matter.
The rationale for why things are blacked out.
Yeah.
Danny, you're reading it there as well. What pops out?
What pops out is, as many have suspected, from the early parts of the investigation, Mueller concluded that he cannot charge a sitting president based on that OLC opinion, and that guided his decision to not make a prosecutorial decision, because what prosecutors do is they allege that people committed a crime, and then we have an adversarial process that allows them to tell their side of the story. That never would have been available here, and consequently, because President Trump would not have the opportunity to defend himself if Mueller simply made a conclusion that he committed a crime without being able to charge him, that justified not making a prosecutorial decision.
It's interesting, because I thought Pete, I don't know if Pete's still with us, I thought Pete saw in a section that wasn't necessarily the determinative issue, that actually they had kind of overcome that hurdle, so to speak, Pete, this issue of the OLC guidance. I'm confused.
That's my reading of it, yes.
Okay, well, you know what? This is, to Neil Katyal's point, Professor Katyal, you do have to actually read the report, and we're all in this together trying to piece it together as best we can and determine what it was. I mean, there is this guidance out there that the Department of Justice and Robert Mueller being an employee of the Department of Justice would have abided by. Pete has read a section of the report that suggests that they felt it does not extend to an obstruction type crime, that it can't possibly mean that. It seems like that was a legal judgment they made.
Absolutely. The president's lawyers evidently went to Mueller and said, you can't apply the obstruction of justice statutes to us as a constitutional matter. You'll restrict the president's power. And that, by the way, was the argument made in that silly 19-page memo that Bill Barr wrote last summer. And the Mueller team obviously rejected that. That's one thing that's in the report, in which they're saying, no, a president can't obstruct justice. It's not interfering with his constitutional responsibilities.
Which it's worth. I'm just looking ahead here. They talk about the Trump Tower meeting, and that they spoke with every participant except Veselitskaya and Donald Trump Jr., who declined to be voluntarily interviewed by the office.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the questions that loomed over this. Who had been interviewed, who asserted their Fifth Amendment, who was not subpoenaed. And, of course, the biggest question of all was, and perhaps answered in these pages, is why Mueller did not pursue a sit-down interview with President Trump. He did accept written answers to questions, but chose not to subpoena him and go into the legal fight that would have ensued.
And that's what I found so interesting about Barr's press conference earlier, which is a very unusual thing for a sitting attorney general to do in advance of the report coming out. But he said, well, I don't think there was intent because Donald Trump was, quote, frustrated. And that is not the way you hear criminal prosecutors ever talk. And it's certainly not if you haven't actually interviewed the president. But that didn't happen here. So how Barr made that determination is something that I think all Americans will be asking.
Let's go back to Pete Williams, who has continued to read ahead of us. And we need a breath here for a second. What more do you see there?
Well, let's dip into Volume 1 a little bit, which is the investigation of whether any members of the Trump campaign illegally were involved with the Russians in helping them meddle, and we know the conclusion was that they didn't, but let me just read a little of this to you. It says the investigation identified numerous links between individuals, and if you want to follow along with me, I'll tell you this is Volume 1, page 9. While the this is the third full paragraph. While the investigation identified numerous links between individuals with ties to the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign, the evidence wasn't sufficient to support criminal charges. For example, it says the evidence wasn't sufficient to charge any campaign official as an unregistered agent of the Russian government or any other Russian principal. And as for that June 9, 2016 meeting and the WikiLeaks releases of hacked materials, the evidence wasn't sufficient to charge a criminal campaign finance violation. And it says also the evidence wasn't sufficient to charge that any member of the Trump campaign conspired with representatives of the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election. So that's a key sentence out of Volume 1. Now, it does go on to say that several people identified with the Trump campaign lied to the special counsel and lied to Congress about their interactions with Russian-affiliated people and related matters. And, of course, we're familiar with the ones that were charged: Papadopoulos, Flynn, Cohen, and Manafort, and most recently Roger Stone, charged with lying to the investigation as well.
All right, Pete, stand by there. We have the president's personal attorney, Jay Sekulow, who has the advantage of having seen this, actually, I think, on Tuesday, Jay.
Hey, Savannah.
Yeah, hi. Good to see you. So people are just trying to ingest this. Sure. What's your understanding, now having read the report, of what exactly Mueller determined on obstruction and the reason why he felt he could not make that prosecutorial judgment call?
Because they had the insufficiency of the evidence that they had could not reach the standard necessary for an obstruction charge. In other words, in the way they put the report out, and you'll get to it as you read it, is they will talk about a particular act. As it relates, for instance, there was, remember the question surrounding General Flynn. And when they went to look at the General Flynn comments, what happens is they make the determination that there was not evidence that the president knew that Flynn had discussed sanctions, and there was not an impediment to the ongoing investigation of General Flynn. So those were two conclusions that then prevent you from making a determination. Now, remember what they say at the end, where they say we don't exonerate him, but we don't find criminal conduct either. Generally, a prosecutor's job is not an exoneration. It's a declination or a prosecution. So in essence, this is a lengthy declination document, not the way it would normally be written under the Justice Department manual. And what Bill Barr said today, I think, is important. Even though they disagreed with the legal theory that was being advocated by Bob Mueller's team, by the special counsel, even looking at it through that lens, they found no obstructive acts.
And Jay, those are all, I'm sorry.
Just a big question here, of course, regards the president's intent. And one thing the Mueller team did not have the advantage of was a sit-down interview with President Trump. Just to be clear, they asked, and did the president decline to sit down and be interviewed?
The president took the advice of his lawyers, which was we produced dozens of witnesses, 1.5 million pages of material, countless hours of testimony, including White House officials. As you know, at the end, no executive privilege was asserted on anything. And the president responded in writing to a series of questions that we thought were appropriate for the president responded to. Our advice to the president was that they did not meet the threshold under what's called the SP standard, the SP test, to have an in-person interview.
Did the questions, the written questions that he answered, did they have to do solely with this issue of conspiracy or collusion, or did it have to do with these obstruction matters? Did he answer questions on that?
We answered questions related to the original mandate of the proceeding, of the inquiry, which was the Russian collusion portion. And, of course, the conclusion on that is that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. That was from, actually, page 2 of the report. So the collusion aspect, it predated the presidency. So you didn't have the same degree of Article 2 issues there that you would have had on issues once the president was sworn into office, or even because we have a transition act, even during the transition issue.
You mentioned
I don't know if Lester's there, but you're in the report, Lester.
Oh, well, thank you.
We've heard.
But looking at the obstruction of justice question, you said on advice of counsel, the president did not testify personally. Why was that? Why would he be given that advice? Was there a fear of potential perjury?
No, it's the reality when you give the kind of information. This was the exact opposite of the way the Clinton inquiry went, where they were fighting over every document and every witness. We decided early on that there would be complete transparency and cooperation. And that transparency and cooperation with the tendering of all those documents and, again, all the witnesses, including senior White House officials, that the decision at that point, once that was done, under the governing law of the D.C. Circuit, they did not meet, in our view, the standard upon which they would then be entitled to a interview of the president.
Well, there's entitled, Jay, as you know, legally entitled, and then there's just a matter of being forthcoming. And, I mean, on the part of the White House saying we've been transparent, we gave all those documents, and there is absolutely no dispute about that. Why not have him just come down and sit down and clear it up and answer those questions? Because it sounds like part of the reason Mueller says he can't decide is because he didn't have the benefit of that conversation.
Here's what you've got. Bob Mueller in his report states that they did not seek a subpoena. They said they thought they'd be entitled to it, but they didn't seek it because they had received all of this information from witnesses that we provided and documents we provided. What's interesting about that, under the law in this circuit, in the District of Columbia, and the law pretty much everywhere else as well, but in the United States District Court and the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, once you've given that kind of information, and Bob acknowledged he received that information unhindered, without any hindrance, it was given to them, that they're not entitled to then sit down with the chief executive, with the president of the United States. We follow the law, not just for this president, Savannah, but for any future president. Because at the end of the day, what this became about was this Russian collusion investigation. That's what started this. Remember, it started under this crossfire hurricane in 2016. And when you go through the main issues that you've talked about on air and have covered, the situation with the Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. Read that in the report and read the conclusions. The Lester Holt interview. Well, because we were able to provide, and you all gave access to the transcripts of as I think you put them on the website, of the entire interview, the president said, look, if I fire James Comey, I realize it's going to extend the investigation. Everybody was clipping that out. We put that in there, and they drew that conclusion that was not, for that reason alone, that was not an obstructive act. So the reason you have a decision to be made of whether a witness or a client sits down to talk to the prosecutors based on the evidence that's presented. But we're also governed by our canon of ethics and the D.C. Bar rules, as well as the governing president of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia.
Jay, let me ask this question as the only non-lawyer in this conversation. This appears, based on what we've seen, a good day for the president here. But let's talk about the American public. Given those 10 items listed, I think more than 10, of potential obstruction of justice, should we feel better or worse about our president today?
Better. Because, number one, every American should be glad to know that there were no attempts by the president or people that were with this campaign to interfere as the Russians were doing in the election. And that is clear and unequivocal. With regard to the obstruction, remember the basis upon which the president was responding to each of the acts that are discussed in this report. And he's responding based on the fact that he was under an investigation that he knew was not right and was, let's be realistic, irregular from the outset. And we don't have to rehearse all those facts again. And what he did, and I think this is what's appropriate here, he responded. His responses did not reach the level of obstruction because look what has happened. Bob Mueller completed and delivered his report. The FBI concluded its investigation. The process went forward and was completed.
Real quickly,
there was no obstruction.
Jay, fair enough, and we're looking at the document, and it says that exact thing. The question I always wonder when I think about this and this whole 2-year ordeal, do you think the president made things harder on himself by being so vocal, by firing James Comey, trying to fire the special counsel, as is established in this report, by railing against Bob Mueller, by continually calling it a witch hunt and a hoax and all of that? Can you imagine a scenario in which he just said, if there was Russian collusion, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I want our law enforcement to do that, and I will wait for their judgment because I'm confident in my behavior and that of my campaign. Didn't he kind of bring this upon himself in a way?
I don't think so. I think the president knew that this investigation from the outset was not justified, that he was being treated unfairly, and look what was learned look what we learned during the course of this investigation. As I said, even under Bob Mueller's watch, the irregularities here are incredible. The Strzok page text messages, Bruce Ornelli or Infusion GPS, all of these issues. So if you were the client under that kind of scenario, let me tell you something, you're going to respond, and the president did. He had the right to do it under Article 2. He had the right to do it under the First Amendment.
Certainly, and by the way, he does have the right, but there were numerous campaign contacts with Russians. You admit that this was a fair subject matter of investigation by our FBI.
Well, look, I'm not. Here's what I'm going to tell you. This investigation was going on since 2016, and Peter Strzok said there is no there months after it started. They knew there was nothing there. They morphed this into an obstruction case. There was no underlying crime, and there ended up being no obstruction.
And within the last half hour, the president again calling this a hoax. It should never happen to another president again.
I hope it doesn't happen to another president.
But can you have it both ways?
Yeah.
Can you call it? Can you call it vindication and great for us, and at the same time call it a hoax? What is it?
Well, it is. The basis upon which this investigation took place, including the FISA warrants, were irregular at best, illegal in many cases, unauthorized. American citizens shouldn't be put through this. And then, of course, the president has been vindicated because not only has and it's very important here, not only has Bob Mueller concluded that there was no collusion with the Russians, which was the whole basis upon which this started. And I'm hopeful that every American's glad to know that. And then number two, and I think equally important here, that even under a twisted theory of obstruction, I call it obstruction by tweet. Even under that twisted theory, they could not write up a report on obstruction. Believe me, if they could have determined that there was obstruction, they would have written that in this report. They did not. It's a lengthy, reluctant declination letter.
Jay Sekulow, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We appreciate talking to you.
Thank you.
And we continue to read on this report. Neil,
certainly.
Listen to that interview.
Wait a minute.
I think
when am I due to hit?
Might get our ears.
No, they want to know if I could talk to Brian Williams.
Okay, if we could just. That was Jason. You guys are all seeing the sausage making.
Apparently, he has another appointment in the building.
Exactly. The attorneys go around, do a round robin of all the different networks. Neil, what did you think of what Mr. Sekulow had to say and what you've been reading in the report?
Yeah, I think the spin is beginning, and we just started to hear it. I isolate 4 things that I thought Mr. Sekulow had problems with. Number one, your question, why didn't Trump just go and talk to Mueller and clear all of this up? I mean, after all, Trump today and for 2 years has been saying, I did nothing wrong, blah, 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 it's all a hoax and so on. Why didn't he ever say that under oath to Mueller? There's no answer to that Mr. Sekulow gave except hiding behind some D.C. Circuit case and some law. But as a matter of prudence, you would expect a president to clear these things out. Number two, he said, well, Trump only talked to Mueller or gave written answers about the original mandate, which he said was the Russia investigation. That's just flatly wrong. The original mandate that Mueller had was the Russia investigation as well as obstruction of justice. And the special counsel regulations say whenever you give the mandate to the special counsel, you also give an obstruction mandate. It's part and parcel of that. Number three, most importantly, Sekulow tried to make it, and now the president is trying to say this shows it's a hoax, total exoneration. Here's the conclusion of the Molar report. Quote, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. And they pointedly don't. So this is not some sort of exoneration memo for the president. The bottom line conclusion is the reverse. And then fourth and finally, at the end of this, Mueller actually comes out vindicated. So you just heard Mr. Sekulow say, the president said this was all a bogus investigation. There's evidence that shows so, text messages and so on. Mueller has page after page in this report showing the Russians interfered with the 2016 election. That's exactly what the president said didn't happen, that this was all a hoax. It might have been some 400-pound person on a laptop and the like. This is a devastating report that shows the Russians did interfere.
And the Attorney General said that as well. We have a piece of the report going to this issue of obstruction. It says, and I'm quoting now, substantial evidence supports the conclusion that the president went further and, in fact, directed White House counsel Don McGahn to call Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, and have the special counsel removed. First, McGahn's clear recollection was that the president directed him to tell Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, not only that conflicts existed, but also that Mueller has to go. McGahn is a credible witness, the report says, with no motive to lie or exaggerate given the position he held in the White House. So this had to do with whether or not what the evidence is in the report of whether or not the president had tried to have the special counsel fired. Does
any of this, and Danny, I'll turn it to you, does this put this to rest, or does this sit out there for a new administration, a new attorney general, to perhaps pick up and prosecute?
It does not put anything to rest. As we all study these pages over the next several days, there are going to be many things in there, things as we sit here right now that we have not yet seen because there's just so much in this report. But building on what Neil said, he's exactly right. That statement by Mueller that if we clearly saw there was no crime, we would so state is unusual for the DOJ to do in the first place. They don't write exoneration reports. But the fact that they said we would have clearly exonerated him if it was there, but we chose not to do so is very telling. The standard for the DOJ in bringing in obstruction or any criminal charge is more than just probable cause. The DOJ manual says so. They have to believe that they can prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. That leaves a gigantic spectrum of evidence somewhere in between where somebody may not be charged, may not be exonerated, but they did something. And that's what we're going to see in this report.
I think that's a really good place for us to pause for a moment because it's, in fairness, this big report ultimately concludes the Trump campaign and its associates did not collude with Russia's efforts, which it establishes, to meddle in our elections. The report says, yes, Russia tried to meddle in our elections. No, the Trump campaign or its associates can't be prosecuted for conspiring to help them do so. And third, it does not render a judgment on whether acts described in this report amount to obstruction of justice under the statutes. And we now know that the Attorney General has gone one step further and said there is not a prosecutable case. So that is the state of the case. That's what this report establishes. But the 400 pages and the details that we all pour over and in candor are pouring over as we speak go to, well, what was the evidence? Is it this close, just this side, just barely able to be prosecuted, or is it far, far, far away from a crime that could be prosecuted? And I think that's where our discussion is right now. What was the conduct? How close did it come to a crime? Was it a mile away, or was it just on the very edge? And I think for people at home watching, I want to understand, what are we talking? Are we nitpicking I think that's where the discussion has to be today as you try to pore over this report.
Absolutely. I think there are three audiences. One is the prosecutorial community, and there, absolutely, this is a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, a really high standard, and it's saying we couldn't commit a crime with respect to, we couldn't find a crime with respect to collusion. But there's two other audiences. Second, the American public. I don't think that they want a president who just skates by on, oh, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt that you colluded with Russia or that you obstructed justice. That's not, I think, an appropriate place for any president of the United States to be. But third and most importantly is the Congress, because these obstruction inquiries in the past have always been resolved by the Congress. And I suspect that with these 10 episodes, with the one that we just saw on the screen about McGahn saying, you tried to fire the special counsel, that's something Congress is going to have to look at. Yeah, the president is responding. He started the day off with several tweets, and now in reaction to this news, he was at an event just a short while ago and spoke about this report. Here's what he had to say.
Hey, I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. This should never happen to another president again. This hoax. This should never happen to another president again.
Notable that no collusion has been his mantra for the last several months, and we heard that repeated several times by the Attorney General in his remarks about an hour or so before we got this report. We want to go back to Pete Williams right now, who has been digesting just as much and as quickly as he can this report. Pete?
So back to Savannah's point about how much of this obstruction stuff is right on the edge. Let me give you an example of, if you want to follow along in your souvenir program, it's page 132 of Volume 2. They talk about the president's public statements and some of his private communications with either Paul Manafort or his lawyers. And it says that this is looking at whether he was trying to influence Manafort by dangling pardons, talking about the prosecution. It says evidence concerning the president's conduct toward Manafort indicates that the president intended to encourage Manafort not to cooperate with the government. The report notes that the president called him a brave man, said he was refusing to break, said this whole idea of pleading guilty in exchange for reduced charges, which the president called flipping, which prosecutors also call flipping, should be outlawed. And the report said the president intended Manafort to believe that he could receive a pardon, which would make any cooperation with the government as a means of getting a lesser sentence unnecessary. Nonetheless, it says there are alternative explanations for the president's comments, including that he genuinely felt sorry for Manafort, or that his goal was not to influence the jury by making these statements, but to influence public opinion. The president's comments also could have been intended to continue sending a message to Manafort that a pardon was possible. As described earlier, the report says the president made his comments about Manafort being a very good person immediately after declining to answer a question about whether he would pardon Manafort. So that's just one little slice of the kind of evidence pointing in two ways on whether the president's actions were intended to influence the justice system and constitute obstruction.
You know, what strikes me about that is the reason that these facts that you just laid out are capable of multiple interpretations about, well, what was the president's intent, is because there was no interview with the president, and because there was ambiguity to that question of his intent. That was one of the key reasons, it seems, Pete, that we're seeing over and over again as to why Mueller felt that he couldn't make a conclusion one way or another, whether this was amounted to obstruction. So that seems to be a key strategic legal decision made by the president's lawyer that seems to have been quite beneficial to him from a legal perspective.
Well, I think that there are several questions here that this report doesn't answer. Number one, why is it? I mean, we understand what the report says, that the evidence pointed in two ways, but many prosecutors, other than folks at the Justice Department, have said he's the special counsel. It's his job to make these decisions. Why didn't he? We have what he says in the report about the evidence pointing in two directions. William Barr felt he could make the conclusion. Why didn't Robert Mueller feel he could make that conclusion? And we're going to have to probably wait until Mueller testifies. And today, as you heard, William Barr said he had no objection to Mueller testifying before Congress to answer these questions. That's one thing. Secondly, why didn't the special counsel insist on interviewing the president? You see what they say in here, that they thought basically they had enough based on his public statements and the statements of other people around the president, and they decided it was near the end of the investigation and there was no point in dragging it out. And then finally, on this point that you two have talked about here, and frankly, Jay Sekulow brought it up, this unusual statement by a prosecutor that they didn't exonerate the president. Many former prosecutors have said that's an odd thing for a prosecutor to say. They're not in the exoneration business. They either bring charges or they don't.
Pete, let me go back to that notion of why they decided not to pursue the interview with the president. You said they had what they need. Did you get, reading between the lines, did you get the sense that they felt the clock was running out, that they simply couldn't keep this investigation alive any longer?
In a word, yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there wasn't any technical reason that they couldn't keep going, but perhaps there was a political one where they
because it
felt
makes me wonder. They weren't
Yeah.
living in a vacuum. They were watching all of us in a country that was, when is it going to come out? When are we going to get some answers?
But it's
here?
interesting that he says that. Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, so we should just step back here and think about how extraordinary this is. We have 400 pages of a report that was, if you read the special counsel rules that our friend Neil Katyal helped draft, they say that the special counsel should submit a very brief report to the president on prosecution and declination decisions, and that was never envisioned to be made public. As a matter of fact, the commentary on the rules that was published in the Federal Register at the time says a problem with Ken Starr and the other independent counsel is that they were required to submit a public report, and it tended to make investigations drag on. I think the word they used in the commentary was it made prosecutors overzealous. So clearly, Mueller's people wrote this with the understanding that it was going to become public. It really is very surprising how much we're seeing here.
It is. Back to this issue of intent. I mean, here they're saying we don't need to do an interview, as I understand it from what Pete's reporting. We don't need to do an interview because we have lots of other information that speaks to his intent, so it's unnecessary, and we're getting to the end of our time here. But at the same time, they then don't make the ultimate decision because it's ambiguous as to what his intent is.
I think we can expect to see Mueller, in front of Congress.
Well, they've already called for him. Already the
So.
Democrats are trying to get Mueller in front of Congress. Maybe he'll have a better explanation of that. But does that strike you?
It's important to understand that obstruction charges don't require an underlying crime if you're deceiving federal authorities or agents. But in this particular case, it is relevant to look at the intent behind why the statements were made, why this conduct occurred. If there is an innocent explanation, and innocent I use loosely, then that's the kind of thing that this report would have considered. The challenge is with the president. He's unlike any other potential target that the DOJ ever deals with, including the special counsel.
So simply loose talk and just bravado could insulate you from a charge.
Well, you could go back even earlier because, as I said, the special counsel concludes from the outset that this was an investigation into obstruction that began and ended with the conclusion that I cannot charge this president. So that guided the investigation all throughout. So that you look at all these very suspicious activities, ultimately it's going to be for the public to decide if those are impeachable offenses, even if they didn't rise to the level of criminal offenses under DOJ standards.
Pete, you want to get in on this?
Well, yeah. If you want to look in your report, look at page 13.
Which
the
volume?
First full paragraph of volume 2, page 13.
Yeah.
That starts, we also sought. This is where it says we did try to interview the president, but after more than a year of discussion, they say, the president declined to be interviewed. So they say he did submit written questions. And then the special counsel says, we thought about actually subpoenaing the president. And first we had to decide whether we had the legal authority to do that. And it says, ultimately, while we believe that we had the authority and the legal justification to issue a grand jury subpoena to get the president's testimony, we chose not to do so. We made that decision in view of the substantial delay that such an investigative step would likely produce at a late stage in our investigation, And we also assessed that based on the significant body of evidence we had already gotten from the president's actions, his public statements, his private statements describing those actions, we knew enough to understand the relevant events and make our assessments. And, you know, make no mistake, as Neil and Danny can say, if they had decided to start a court fight over whether the president can be subpoenaed and forced to testify before a grand jury, that would have taken maybe a year to resolve. It certainly would have gone to the Supreme Court. It would have gone to district court here, then the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. It would have taken a long time if they had decided to do that and the White House had resisted.
Right. But I still have the same question, because what they're saying is it would have been a big fight. It would have taken forever, but we already had enough information. We have all his public statements. We have a good sense of what his intent was. But then they ultimately don't make the ultimate decision. They don't decide. That's the part I can't connect.
Well, I think that's because we're being influenced by Barr's press conference, in which he made it seem like there wasn't evidence for intent. But I think, and you just heard Mr. Sekulow say something very similar, I think you pointed on exactly that question. What is the evidence of intent? And Mr. Sekulow said, oh, this is going to really clear the president. But I think I'm already starting to see stuff in the report that's actually really bad day for the president. Let me just read to you page 290. So the president directed McGahn, his White House counsel, to have Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, have the special counsel removed. And here's what the report says, quote, McGahn, this is the president's lawyer, spoke with the president twice and understood their directive the same way both times, making it unlikely that he misheard or misinterpreted the president's request. In response, McGahn decided to quit because he didn't want to participate in events that he described as akin to the Saturday night massacre, called his lawyer, drove to the White House, packed up his office, prepared to submit a resignation letter with his chief of staff, told the chief of staff the president had asked him to do crazy expletive word, and informed Priebus and Bannon that he was leaving. That is not a good day for the president.
Criminal, though?
Well, I think it's at least, obstruction of justice in the criminal sense, and certainly in the congressional sense.
I mean, so much of this is framed legally, and so much of it is framed morally. And that'll be based on the judgment of the American people, whether it's on a legal basis or, as I asked Jay Sekulow, is this should Americans feel better about their president today?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, morally, this is the president's own lawyer saying, you're asking me to do crazy stuff. This is akin to the Saturday night massacre in Watergate, and I have to resign.
But ultimately, what I keep coming back to is that Mueller had those facts. Obviously, we're reading from his report, but he doesn't think that that is sufficient to establish a crime of obstruction of justice. I think we understand him to say, and it's not just because he's a sitting president and he can't be charged.
Well, I don't know that it's that he can't find the obstruction charge. I think he's saying, as his predecessors have, that's really a responsibility for Congress to determine in the first instance when we're talking about a presidential level investigation.
I know that's true, but if I'm sitting at home, I'm going, well, then why were you doing this report in the first place? Then
to find the
facts. To send them
remember, the House at that time was controlled by Republicans, and they were investigating Benghazi the whole time, and the Senate, similar thing. So there was only one place to do this.
You feel like Mueller thought his job, his commission, find the facts, marshal the facts, send them to Congress, let Congress decide what the remedy, if any, is.
Absolutely. I think after the November election, that's when we started to hear, the Mueller investigation's wrapping up, because now there was someone else to carry that football forward.
And through these last 2 years, this has been loosely, alternately referred to as the Russia investigation, and we've got a little more insight into the contacts with the Russians. Let's go to Andrea Mitchell for that. Andrea?
Well, there's a number of references in the report. First of all, that because of encrypted messaging and deleted messages and communications between key officials in the Trump campaign and others, that they could not get to certain facts in order to make decisions about what is called conspiracy or collusion. There's also some intriguing overtures from Russia. The outreach from the Russian government on approximately 3 a.m. on election night, or the night after, obviously the morning after. Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a call on her personal cell from a 202, a Washington, D.C. area code, but with someone from a foreign accent saying that it was a Putin call, and that this caller said that they would be sending an email, and it was a message from Putin to the now president-elect. She tried through Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, to ascertain who this person was. And the days that followed, there were a number of outreaches, not just from the ambassador to the new president, which would have been completely appropriate, but also from private sector people. And this leads up to an extensive discussion of what has been a very suspicious contact with Eric Prince, a big fundraiser, an outside fundraiser for the Trump campaign, but the brother of the incoming Secretary of Education. And he traveled to the Seychelles, if you will remember, and said at the time the public statements were that he just happened to meet with a Russian. But apparently that meeting, according to this report, was carefully briefed in advance at Trump Tower to a number of people, including Steve Bannon, and that he was going to meet with this Russian who was the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, very close to Vladimir Putin, and that this meeting was to discuss a number of issues regarding U.S.-Russian relations. And that, in fact, he came back, went to Steve Bannon's home, and according to Eric Prince's testimony, briefed Bannon extensively. Bannon did not recollect that, and there were no contemporaneous communications that were provided to the special counsel. So there's a lot of smoke here, but they could not actually prove some of these very suspicious contacts between close members of the Trump organization, the Trump campaign, and Russians.
All right, Andrea.
Thank you so much. We've talked a lot this morning about this issue of obstruction. The report is divided into two volumes. Volume 1 having to do with this issue of conspiracy or collusion, any cooperation with Russians.
Yeah.
You're holding them. Your muscles are growing as we speak. Volume 2 having to do with obstruction. We've talked a lot about obstruction. Andrea was touching on this issue, these foreign contacts. And for that, I want to go to Jeremy Bash, who was a former chief of staff at the CIA and the Department of Defense under the Obama administration. And Jeremy, put your intelligence hat on for a second. What so far have you gleaned in terms of the context around these contacts that the special counsel says did occur between associates and members of the Trump campaign and the Russians? Fell short of a conspiracy case that could be prosecuted, but what did it find in terms of the evidence?
Yeah, well, Savannah, beginning on page 53 of the report, there's a lot of detailed information about how Jerome Corsi was in touch with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Much of that section is redacted, presumably because it involves the prosecution of Roger Stone, someone who we know was in direct contact with the Trump campaign and with the candidate Trump himself. There's also a section that describes communications between Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks itself. In one case, WikiLeaks asked Donald Jr. to publish information that was derogatory of Hillary Clinton, suggesting she had tried to target Julian Assange with a drone strike, as crazy as that sounds. And Don Jr. responded that he had already done so. I mean, he had already put out that information. In another case, he retweeted information that WikiLeaks had sent him and asked him to retweet and publish. There's also a lot of information about the Trump Tower meeting, Savannah. And basically, at the end of the day, the prosecutors in the special counsel's office concluded that it could not determine beyond a reasonable doubt that the Trump campaign knew that it was a violation of law, that the dirt they were receiving on Hillary Clinton was valued enough to satisfy the statutory requirements, and that fundamentally that they knew that it was a federal crime to be receiving this derogatory information. So essentially, we know they were engaging in this unethical, inappropriate, unpatriotic conduct, but it wasn't illegal.
All right, and the Trump Tower meeting, for those who aren't familiar, was June 9th, 2016, a meeting with the top of the Trump campaign, including Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and they met with some Russians who earlier had said they had dirt on Hillary Clinton, and that was a big part of what Robert Mueller looked into.
Let me bring Chuck Todd into this right now. Chuck, let's look at this from a political perspective. In 30 minutes, the Attorney General came out and gave a glowing report on this report, and essentially exonerated, used the term there was no collusion several times. That's been the mantra of the president. Right. In the meantime, over the last hour, we have all been going page by page, looking at black lines, trying to find the story. From a political standpoint, is this a clean win for the president?
No, I don't think it's a clean win, but the waters were muddied before, and I think it certainly isn't going to, change the larger sort of parameters of the political debate about Russian interference and all of this. But, you guys were setting up an interesting back and forth when you were talking on the obstruction front, which is there's legal, there's ethical, there's moral. I want to go to the Russian part of this, because when you read, and this is where the Attorney General really overly glossed over, and if anything, I think warped the view of the report, and that is on the Russian interference aspect of it. Essentially, Bob Mueller proves that the Trump campaign was cheerleading Russia, was well aware of what they were doing, was hoping it would be as effective as it turned out to be. They just couldn't prove that they helped the Russians do this, that they were part of it. They were sort of cheerleading it. And this is where I wish all of us would take a step back, and every elected official, which is the fact that the president and all of his allies are going, no collusion, this is great, and not upset at the morality of an American presidential campaign cheering foreign interference. And my concern after all of this, and the way that particularly one political party is embracing the conclusions of this report, is that it could mainstream the idea of foreign interference. And I read this Mueller report, and I'm curious of our legal minds there, as saying we didn't really have laws to deal with when American citizens are essentially opening the door for foreign interference. Right? There's a campaign finance law that they couldn't specifically use as sort of an in-kind contribution, things like that. But it is not exculpatory at all when you read this. It's clear that the Trump campaign was cheering all of this, hoping that there was a lot more, and trying to figure out ways how to get it into the ether even faster.
Let's go to, it's an interesting point you raised, Chuck. I mean, let's go to Danny Savalas on that. Is that the case, that the statutes just aren't built for the situation and the conduct that is described in this report?
Chuck is exactly right. When it comes to conspiracy, it does not take much in the way of overt acts. Sometimes it takes virtually nothing at all to make you a co-conspirator. But simply reacting with glee, being happy about something bad happening, or even a crime being committed, does not bring you into the conspiracy. And I think early on we saw that with Roger Stone, who, in his very long indictment, was charged with a form of obstruction with false statements, but all that seemingly bad stuff he did vis-a-vis WikiLeaks, he was not charged with. So we've long known that it may have been the possibility that the Trump campaign did just about everything except cross that threshold into conspiracy, because, as I've said, being thrilled or happy about the fact that a computer is being hacked, or that WikiLeaks is releasing the information, or that it got it through illegal means, is not itself criminal.
And the report talks about that, saying, you know, just the mere dissemination of this information, unless you can establish that an actor was involved in the illegal getting of it, the hacking of it, was not going to be sufficient to charge a crime.
Not sufficient, but very close. You don't need a whole lot more, maybe even a phone call, arrange a meeting. For whatever reason, the special counsel did not find the overt acts necessary to reach that level. But
was this a long shot from the beginning? I know there's going to be a lot of revisionist look at this whole thing, but standing back, was this going to be a difficult case to make?
As to the collusion.
Collusion.
All they needed was to connect the dots between the campaign, any of those intermediaries, say, for example, Roger Stone, and some act that was maybe a quid pro quo, leaving a bag of cash in exchange, for example, for release of information, or participating in some way, not necessarily doing the hacking themselves, but facilitating, assisting the hackers in some way, perhaps providing them money, perhaps providing them resources. So in that sense, if they didn't find those overt acts that would be traditionally necessary to make a conspiracy, then that would have been a challenge.
Did they get close based on what you've seen so far?
I think when you're talking about reacting with happiness to a known crime being committed, I think you can read between the lines, and that is close, because if you have that special knowledge that a crime is being committed and about to be committed, that alone isn't criminal, but it sure sounds criminal.
One thing I want to know when I really can read this is what evidence, if any, there is, Neil, of the Trump campaigns or any of the associates' knowledge that it really was the Russians behind this hacking and these leaks. That seems very, crucial. It's one thing to cheer it on and not know, oh, it's just WikiLeaks, it's DC leaks. What was the level and status of knowledge of any Trump associate? And I don't know if the report answers that.
Right. I think you're asking a crucial question, and I'm realizing now that I've read parts of the report, there's a part that hasn't been reported yet that I think is really important that bears on that. So it's not just about the statutes, about conspiracy, or about the facts of the Russian collusion. Mueller says clearly at the beginning of his report that he applied a legal standard that could not implicate the president. That is, he's saying, I write this report, and if I think the president committed a crime, I'm not even going to tell you. He says, we considered whether to evaluate the conduct we investigated under the DOJ manual governing prosecutorial and declination decisions, but we determined not to apply that approach that could potentially result in a judgment the president committed crimes. Fairness concerns counsels against potentially reaching that judgment when no charges can be brought. So as I read it, what Mueller is saying here is, in this entire report, I'm applying a legal standard in which even if I thought Trump committed crimes, I wouldn't say so in this report. And that really puts to the test what you just heard Jay Sekulow say, that this is a declination thing. It clears the president, what the president said. Oh, it's a good day for him. No, there's nothing in this report because that Mueller said I couldn't do that.
Well, and is that going only to this issue of conspiracy and collusion with Russia or the whole thing?
Whole hog. The whole report is written under that assumption. It's right at page 2 of his report.
Okay, but if there had been other associates who had conspired and met the definition, and they could have been charged.
And many, of course, were, right? So you have...
They were charged, though, with false statements or obstruction or that kind of thing, with the exception of Paul Manafort.
Exactly. But when it comes to Trump and his own wrongdoing, particularly when it comes to obstruction, I think it's real important to understand the standard Mueller used.
Do we have Pete to speed up right now? Yeah, Pete,
Yes,
I want to talk to you about those who have tried to discredit the work of Mueller, the special counsel's office. The Attorney General himself dropped that little grenade about spying. Is there anything in here that gets to the origins of this investigation and the way that it was conducted?
Yes, there's a factual predicate laid out for what got them onto this in the first place. And that's pretty well known right now. The meeting that a campaign aide, George Papadopoulos, had with a foreign ambassador who promised, a former diplomat who promised to said he could get dirt on the Hillary Clinton campaign. That was relayed to the U.S. by the Australian embassy. And today, by the way, the Australians for the first time said, yeah, we raised our hand. We admitted we had a role in this. So the origins of this are clear. I think what the Attorney General is talking about is the concern by some Republicans in Congress about the reliance early on by the FBI in some of the people that were involved in the Mueller investigation who had sent messages suggesting they had an animus toward Donald Trump, and secondly, what many conservatives have said was an over-reliance on this dossier to the extent that that involved Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act surveillance against Trump associate Carter Page. I assume that's what Barr is talking about, but I think that the distinction has to be drawn between the early days of the FBI's investigation and then the later stages when Mueller came into it.
Yeah, important point. Pete, thanks.
And one other point, I think, going back to this this question that we keep coming back to is, well, if Mueller had all this evidence, why does he say it points in both directions? And the report keeps coming back to 3 points that they say point both ways. First of all, they say, and this has been something that's been raised by the defenders of the president since the early days after Comey was fired, the report says some of what the president did, he had the authority to do. Because he's the president, he could fire the FBI director. Now, of course, the report goes on to say, if you fire him for a corrupt reason, that's a problem. But the point is, the president had the authority to do many of these things. Secondly, they say, no cover-up of an underlying crime. We've talked about that. And thirdly, they say, this is interesting, they say many of the president's actions were public. Many of these were statements he made in public, or tweets he made in public, or actions that he took in public. That doesn't absolve them of potential taint of criminality, the report says, but it's a factor that we had to consider.
Yeah, and he had, and they lay out that he had the right to fire Comey. But in my conversation with the president, he was the one that brought up Russia. I was thinking of this Russia thing. Did that not then put it in a whole different category of statements and actions?
Well, again, that's the sort of the double-headedness of this, according to the Mueller report, is on the one hand, he had the authority to do it, no question. No one questions that. Comey doesn't even question it. But the report says if it's done for the wrong reason, it can be corruption. It can be a corrupt act. It could be an obstruction. So they say it points both ways.
All right, Pete Williams, this is a challenge. I know we're all trying to read
it. It's such a challenge. I wish that I really, on behalf of our viewers, wish that we had a little more clarity, because I myself, sitting here, have heard a lot of different answers with regard to one big issue, which we just talked about with Professor Katyal, but Pete seemed to say something different. Everybody seems to have a different view of it, which is, did Robert Mueller not ultimately charge an obstruction crime because the Department of Justice says he cannot indict a sitting president, or not? Barr says his own analysis on that issue had nothing to do with that constitutional question about whether a president can be indicted, and had everything to do with the facts not being sufficient to establish obstruction of justice. So that's Barr. But what about Robert Mueller? Pete said one thing. My old Professor Neal said something else, and I really think this is important for our viewers to understand.
Yeah, as I read the first few pages of the report, it is saying the standard that Mueller applied was, because I can't indict a sitting president, it's unfair for me to accuse him of committing crimes when I can't bring those charges and have the president defend himself in court. So if that's right, and, I defer to our dear Pete Williams on this, but if that's right, all of this stuff we're hearing from the president's lawyers and the president himself about this totally exonerating him is bunk.
It's hugely significant. If he said, I'm not even going to go there because I can't, as a matter of practice and the matter of law or the manual of the Department of Justice, that's a much different thing than saying, I didn't find a crime. I looked everywhere and I didn't find one.
And how do you determine that there was no collusion if, in fact, there's evidence that there may have been obstruction, even if there was no intent that there was obstruction? How do you get back? I know it's maybe a circular argument.
It is a little bit circular. It does appear, just from looking quickly at the report, that Mueller believed that you could charge someone for obstruction of justice even if there isn't an underlying offense. Normally, you do have an underlying offense. So, someone goes and robs a bank, and then they go and destroy the evidence afterwards about the bank robbery. Here, Mueller said, well, I might not be able to necessarily prove the underlying offense, but still, under precedent, that's a prosecution that could be brought in ordinary circumstances. Barr appears to have disagreed with that.
I know, Pete, you went in on this, right? What do you think on that issue?
Yeah, well, so on what we're just talking about, this is, I think, maybe a good summary that Mueller offers here. He says, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would say so. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we can't reach that judgment. The evidence we got about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal action occurred, and that's why they say we don't conclude that this report exonerates him.
But Pete, I think the question is, that's about exoneration and the standard that is being applied there. The first part of the report says, if Mueller wanted to implicate the president in a crime, I won't do that in this report because that would be unfair under DOJ policy in which he would have no opportunity to defend himself.
Pete, did you catch that? I think, Danny, this is what you were saying earlier on.
Yes.
The first time this issue came up, and I think our two lawyers here agree that Mueller's analysis was, I can't indict under Department of Justice guidelines, therefore I'm not examining this issue with whether or not he committed the crime of obstruction of justice.
We learned from the outset that Mueller concluded, I cannot indict, therefore all I can do is amass evidence. And candidly, I don't know that he was concerned with who would ultimately make that decision, because that was not his duty as he saw it. A potentially thorny issue that Neal raises is, yes, Barr seems to say that I didn't address the issue of whether or not a sitting president can be indicted, where it seems very clear that Mueller did consider that, and it colored his decision. A related but almost the same issue to whether a president can be indicted is, can a president obstruct justice? I noticed in Barr's letter that he mentioned whether a president can be charged. Noticeably absent was his discussion of whether a president can obstruct justice. And we know that Barr has some thoughts on the issue because he authored an unsolicited 19-page memorandum on the topic that Professor Katyal has said many times is flat wrong. I believe I don't want to put words in your mouth, right? But I think you've made it clear you disagree. So it's an interesting issue. Was this deliberate? Is Barr essentially saying, I didn't deal with whether or not a president can be charged because, parenthetically, I never had to because I already don't think he can obstruct justice? Maybe we'll never know.
And further to the perception that this attorney general is just acting as the president's lawyer, the president's arguments for why he couldn't obstruct justice, so we now have them in the Mueller report, they're exactly the arguments in the 19-page memo.
Well, both volumes of this report likely falling with a thud for a lot of Democrats right now. Let's go to Casey Hunt right now on Capitol Hill to tell us what plays out now, what happens now. We suspect a lot.
Did land with a thud, Lester, that's right. But I actually think there's an important piece of this conversation that you're just having right now about what Robert Mueller thought about all of these precedents and the obstruction question and how it relates to Congress. Because just a few paragraphs above what Pete Williams was just reading, Robert Mueller talks about how the president is not categorically and permanently immunized from obstructing justice through the use of his Article II powers. And he said that the separation of powers doctrine authorizes Congress to protect proceedings and that the president is not inherently protected from quote unquote corrupt actions that are designed at protecting himself. So one of the big questions we had here on the Hill was whether or not Mueller was going to say that this question about obstruction of justice was one for proceedings in Congress and potentially impeachment proceedings. And I think there's going to be a lot more here to work with and a lot more pressure for Democrats to continue to investigate this question of whether the president obstructed justice. Now, we know from a political perspective that there's not a whole lot of appetite from the Speaker of the House to move forward with such a proceeding, which, of course, is where this would all start to unfold as Democrats control that chamber. But considering the actions that we saw from the Attorney General today, the pressure is already ramping up on the left side of the Democratic Party on their leaders to try and take a stronger stand and to show that this just incredible narrative of what the president was doing in the Oval Office and instructing the people around him to do was something that they actually should take official action here in Congress.
And they'll get a less sanitized version of this report, correct?
We're working on figuring out exactly which information. We know from Pete's reporting on the Roger Stone case that they are going to get some additional information that the public is not able to see. What we don't know yet is that going to differ from committee to committee? For example, might the Intelligence Committee see classified information, whereas other committees might be able to see information related to an ongoing investigation, et cetera. So that's all things that we're reporting out today, Lester.
All right. Thank you, Casey. This is a lot of pages here, and they're going to be spinning, literally spinning from different viewpoints and different sides.
A lot to digest. The good news is all of this is public, and the American people are able to read it in redacted form. Some of it is blacked out, but they will be able to make their own judgments. You can find the full report at NBCnews.com. And, of course, we'll continue to cover this on MSNBC. We've got to give our thanks to our legal analyst and to Pete Williams, speed reader extraordinaire. And, of course, Lester, you're going to have all of it on Nightly News.
Yeah, I'll be spending the next several hours digesting this as well. We'll see you on NBC Nightly News. And, of course, as developments warrant, we'll come back on the air. Good night.
Magic words, and his counsel's not saying, I'm going to pardon you, we're going to pardon you, but rather you'll be taken care of. So American people in Congress need to decide whether this is what we want from our president, whether in fact dangling pardons, promising that you'll be taken care of is acceptable conduct. And then I want to just follow up on the congressman's statements about Barr and where we are with him. If I'm Christopher Wray right now, the current director of the FBI, and I'm interacting every day with this Attorney General, I need to ask myself, will he have my back? When I present him sensitive corruption cases, and Brian, on any given day, the FBI is operating hundreds of public corruption cases at all levels across the country. If I share that with the Attorney General in my daily briefing, can I trust that that's not going to the White House or not going to the Republican target of a corruption investigation? And some hard questions need to be asked about whether there's continued effectiveness possible from this Attorney General.
Also, I'm sitting here reading about the president's public statements during the Manafort trial, Frank, speaking of stuff out of a movie, including during jury deliberations, had the potential to influence the trial jury. Quote, the potential to influence jurors who learned of the statements which the president made just as jurors were considering whether to convict or acquit Manafort. That's a screenplay.
The timing of this, the public, we're watching obstruction and tampering take place in plain view as this plays out, is again, in my opinion, evidence of criminality. We understand that the Attorney General took that call as his own and made the call, but there's increasing reasons and the increasing basis in this report to have Congress say, we've got to take this on ourselves at this point.
Barrett Berger, formerly of the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York. Barrett, I understand you and I have been reading apparently the same section, which is about the fact that Mueller is limited to the president's written responses. It's been surmised publicly and rather directly that this wasn't the president up late at night in the residence with a legal pad, carefully writing out his responses. Customarily, these are your attorneys writing what you want to say. And there's a little bit of a powerlessness in the remarks in the Mueller report here, in that they were limited just to that, and they couldn't ascertain more because there was no interview.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's a great word, the powerlessness. I mean, if you look at the report, the special counsel's office says multiple times that the written answers were inadequate, were insufficient, that they didn't feel that they got a full accounting of what the president knew for this. But they also say pretty clearly that they weighed this possibility of whether they should, go forward with a subpoena of the president, but they ultimately decided that it wasn't worth the delay that would inevitably cause to the investigation. In fact, they point to the written answers, and they say that there are 30 instances where the president says he doesn't recall or doesn't remember. That's certainly the work of lawyers there, and it's scripted, and to me it is just disheartening that the special counsel's office had to conclude their investigation without getting satisfactory answers from the president on these pretty basic questions. And more importantly, it really goes in direct contradiction with what Barr said this morning about how the White House was fully cooperating with this investigation. I just don't know how you call this full cooperation when the special counsel's office is left saying that the written responses were insufficient.
That is a great point in summation. Barbara McQuaid has been reading her portions, and Barbara, I understand you have a reminder for us that this, at the end of the day, is about Russia.
Yeah, to me, that's the part I've been focusing on, is what was Russia up to and what was the Trump campaign up to try to interfere with our election. And a couple of things that were not previously known that I think are really important. One is Konstantin Kilimnik, the person to whom Paul Manafort gave that polling data that we talked about earlier. The special counsel supports the FBI's assessment that he was affiliated with Russian intelligence. They say that based on their witness interviews and emails obtained through court-ordered search warrants, they have concluded that the FBI's assessment is correct, that he was a member of Russian intelligence. And so what does that say? Again, even if we can't make the link that a conspiracy was committed here as a matter of law, that we have the Trump campaign sharing polling data with Russian intelligence. I think that's something that Congress needs to consider very seriously. And then, in addition, the report also says that when he asked Russia to find Hillary Clinton's 30,000 emails, he didn't just make that statement to the public. He actually said it repeatedly. Michael Flynn said he requested it repeatedly of staff, and that Michael Flynn himself reached out to Peter Smith, the now deceased Republican operative that we've heard about, who set up a company and was hiring security experts to try to obtain all of these emails so that they could be weaponized and used against her. And so, but for incompetence, perhaps, President Trump would have committed the crime of conspiracy.
So back up, it wasn't just in response to Katie Tur's question in public that the president said, in effect, Russia, if you're able to find those 30,000 emails.
Yes, according to the report, page 62 of Volume 1, it says that Trump asked individuals with his campaign to find those deleted emails. Michael Flynn said he made this request repeatedly, and so as a result, Flynn took it upon himself to contact multiple people in an effort to obtain those emails. So they took it as a directive, and they acted on it, in fact, forming a company and hiring security experts to try to find those emails.
Back here at the table to Nicole and then Matt Miller. Take first of our many steps back. Are you finding why the president may have tweeted 10 times this morning before we read this?
I think that what's clear, again, we keep trying to sort of go back and forth between the trees and the forest. The forest that has been clear for many, many months is even clearer now. If the president wasn't sweating this out, he would not have acted the way he acted yesterday, the day before yesterday, or every morning the last 22 months, where he literally rises and tweets, "No collusion, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation." Now, I find it hard to believe that the president had a nuanced understanding, as Jay Sekulow seemed to, of sort of the narrowness of the question Mueller was probing, the actual requirements to have criminally conspired with Russia. Mm-hmm. But it does suggest that he had some awareness that people on his campaign were doing all the things we've been talking about, all the things that are made abundantly clear, even in this redacted version of the Mueller report, that they were collusion curious, as some reporters have described them, that they were dabbling in collusion, that they were open to collusion, that they were wannabe colluders, and they were in receipt. And even Barr, in that very, very weighted and selectively edited statement he gave from the Justice Department briefing room, had to acknowledge that the WikiLeaks dissemination was not something they were free of or innocent of, but simply that it wasn't a crime. So I think, and again, not to keep going back to Jay Sekulow, but what they were looking for was so narrow. They were looking for their client, the American president, to escape these very, very, very high bars of criminality around conspiracy with the Russians, and it would appear that he did. It does not mean that his campaign wasn't dabbling in collusion the entire time. It does not mean that as an administration we've done anything differently to prevent something that looks exactly like this from happening in 2020. And on obstruction, Mueller clearly found that he was obstructing almost all day, every day, around the firing of Comey, around the attempts to fire Mueller, around the attempts to get Sessions to unrecuse. They're all detailed. They basically prove that all those things happened. They simply got wrapped around the axle of Article 2 authority and around proving intent without an interview.
Luckily, this president has a pliant attorney general.
Clearly, and a very amped up, jacked up message operation. Sean Hannity said 2 years ago that Richard Nixon wouldn't have had to resign if he'd had Fox News. Actually, I think Geraldo said it to Sean Hannity, and they chuckled. That might be true, because this conduct is as sort of impeachable looking, if you put it in a time capsule, as Nixon's conduct. But what Nixon didn't have was an overdrive sort of social media, we now know aided and abetted by Russian trolls, and a news network dedicated to amplifying what is a very subjective read of a report that, in the end, if it exonerates them, why are they so upset by all the details?
Matt Miller, and then I'm going to go to Jeremy Bash.
I want to go back from the forest into one of the trees, because there's something rather remarkable I found here about when the president first finds out about how serious his investigation is and how he finds out about it. So on March 9th of 2017, Comey, then still the FBI director, goes and briefs the Gang of Eight leaders. And there's always been a lot of speculation that Devin Nunes was serving as a back channel to the White House. If the report finds it, I haven't gotten to that section yet, but what it does find is that the Senate Intelligence Chairman Richard Burr was a back channel, that Jim Comey went and briefed the Gang of Eight and told them who the targets are, and then Richard Burr has a meeting or a phone call with the White House counsel's office and informs them of the targets. Annie Donaldson, who is Don McGahn's chief of staff, has notes going through listing Flynn, the Greek guy, who they think refers obviously to George Papadopoulos, Carter Page, and others, and that the president, in reaction to that, POTUS is in panic, chaos, need binders to put in front of him. Two things I take from that. One, it's a real breach of appropriate behavior by Richard Burr, who we all thought was kind of behaving responsibly in this investigation,
a model
especially as opposed to Nunes. I mean, that for him to go and feed information back channel to the president is really inappropriate, and I think he's going to have to answer questions about that. But second, that gives you something about this president's state of mind early on before he fired Jim Comey. He finds out through a back channel from the Hill just what the FBI is investigating, and he goes into a panic and then starts to take the obstructive acts that we later see.
Julia Ainsley and then Jeremy Bash. Julia, you've found an additional something?
I did. I think this is another time where we see the remarks that we got from the Attorney General not panning out and what is actually contained in this report. And that's on the issue of White House cooperation. Today, the Attorney General said that the White House was fully cooperative, answered all of the questions, and the president was extremely forthcoming. That is not what Special Counsel Mueller laid out here. They talk about the written responses that they got in late November of 2014. And they said that in December, the next month, they informed the counsel at the White House of the insufficiency of those responses in several aspects. They noted, among other things, that the president on more than 30 occasions said he does not recall or does not remember or have an independent recollection of information that they asked him about. They also said that in the informed responses that they demonstrate the inadequacy of the written format, and that's why they wanted this sit-down interview. So they went back and forth, and they again requested an in-person interview that would be limited to certain topics, and then the president still declined. So that shows that there was this push and pull, and we reported on this last fall and into the holiday season about the idea that the president was so unwilling to sit down for an interview. We knew he was doing these written responses. It's something that his legal team kept saying would suffice, but it's clear that Mueller didn't think that they sufficed, and they wanted more information, and they did not get it. And of course, when you're trying to prove an obstruction crime, you need intent, you need the information, and you need the person you're investigating to try to give you a window into their frame of mind. And it's clear here that the president just shut down on those issues.
Julia, while I have you, before I go to Jeremy, just to pick your brain, I'm reading this one specific quote. When the president called McGahn a second time to follow up on the order to call the Department of Justice, McGahn recalled the president was more direct, saying something like, call Rod, tell Rod that Mueller has conflicts and can't be special counsel. Remind our audience this conflict that became so large in the president's mind. Where did that start? At how small a level did that start?
Well, the conflict, the idea from the very beginning that the president was upset on the day he was told they would appoint a special counsel. He was furious of Jeff Sessions for recusing himself and for allowing Rod Rosenstein to be in a position to then appoint Robert Mueller. That's where you get some of those heated conversations that are detailed in this report about the president using foul language, leaning back in his chair and saying this is the worst thing that has ever happened to him and that it could ruin his presidency. That's where the heat of that frustration and anger began, and then he started to take it out on his attorney general and then on his legal counsel in the White House legal counsel's office, Don McGahn. He wanted McGahn to have a direct line to McGahn, who would have a direct line to Rod Rosenstein, who could then fire Robert Mueller. He wanted this to go away, and he was very frustrated by the fact that there are protections that keep him from doing that. And I think you see that again and again, and McGahn would stand up and try to say, I will resign, or I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to follow through on that order. And another piece I thought was key was that then Chief of Staff John Kelly told McGahn that when he went into a meeting with the president and the Oval Office that he could not resign no matter what happened. In other words, you need to sit there and take this from the president because he's very unhappy with you.
All right, Julia Ainsley, thanks. To Jeremy Bash at long last. Jeremy?
Two things, Brian. First of all, from my perspective as a former intelligence community official, I'm really struck by page 56 of Volume 2, in which the president opens his daily briefs, presidential daily briefs, with the intelligence leadership, not by trying to understand the threats facing our country and our world, but by directing them to put out press statements saying that there was no collusion. And in one instance, he called the director of NSA and the deputy director of NSA on page 56, and those senior officials said it was the most unusual request and concerning request they have received in 40 years of government service. They documented it, put it in the safe, because they thought it was so inappropriate from the president. I think that's very telling about the president's state of mind and the way he interfaces with the intelligence community. But I think that the largest issue here in Volume 2 is really the opening set of paragraphs on page 1 and 2. We've been talking about it somewhat throughout the afternoon. But what they say very clearly, what the Office of Special Counsel says very clearly is, number one is they are abiding by the OLC guidance that you cannot prosecute a sitting president. And so the prosecutorial decision was made in that light. Second, that they are preserving evidence because presidents can be prosecuted after they leave office. How ominous is that? Third, that it would have been unfair to them just to allege crimes, even though they couldn't prosecute the president, allege crimes because the president in this proceeding couldn't really defend himself like a typical defendant could clear his name in court. And so they conclude, basically, we are not going to judge the president's conduct through the lens of criminality. We are not going to say whether the president engaged in crimes. That's why they say it raises difficult issues. It wasn't, as Barr told us this morning, or tried to tell us, that the president has a clean bill of health, that he didn't obstruct any activities, and that he comported himself legally. No, not at all. The special counsel is actually saying the exact opposite.
To Nicole Wallace.
Jeremy, I have a question for you. You've been part of all of the conversations that we've had over the last 2 years about the president's incredibly curious and until today inexplicable conduct around Vladimir Putin, whether it's his Helsinki press conference performance, whether it's trotting out a line that most Russians don't even accept, that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was noble and whatnot. Is there anything on the conduct that led former acting FBI Director Andy McCabe to open a full field investigation that included the president in that first quarter of his presidency? Are there any answers around any of that conduct that so alarmed the FBI that they added the president to a full field investigation in the counterintelligence sense?
Oh, good question, Nicole. Look, long before there was Russian hacking and even WikiLeaks, there was the Trump Tower Moscow deal. And this report by the special counsel details the origins of that deal and the great lengths that Felix Sater and Michael Cohen went to finalize that deal at one point in December 2015, so just weeks before the Iowa caucuses during the 2016 campaign. The Russians basically said, send us the passports for Trump and Cohen. We'd like to host them here. Michael Cohen made copies of their passports, sent them over to Russia. There was ongoing dialogue. Trump repeatedly asked about it. In this report, Michael Cohen refers to it as a, quote, billion-dollar deal. It would have been the most significant deal in the history of the Trump organization, the recent history of the Trump organization. And so the financial ties between the Trump organization and the Russian Federation are something that are touched upon here. And that's, I think, a key point of leverage that the Russian Federation could have potentially had over Donald Trump.
It also, Jeremy, leaves the Schiff investigation into whether or not the president was compromised, not what Mueller was examining, which was whether or not he was a witting criminal conspirator with the Russian interference effort, but whether or not the president was simply compromised by all those financial ties. Is that still a worthwhile open question?
Absolutely, Nicole. I think many of us had thought that the way Bob Mueller would have approached this would be to look at two big issues, criminality and national security threats. Because, of course, the FBI, the Justice Department, does play a role in defending our country from security threats. That's what the National Security Division does. They are part of the intelligence community. However, it seems that Bob Mueller construed his writ more narrowly, looking primarily and only at whether or not crimes had been committed. Okay, he did that. He discharged his obligations there. It leaves open, Nicole, the question you posed, which is, what are the ongoing threats to national security? What leverage does Russia have over our foreign policy? And that's really for Congress.
Jeremy, I'm reading just page 158, the end of part 1. President attempted to remove the special counsel. He sought to have the Attorney General limit the investigation. He sought to prevent public disclosure of information. He used public forums to attack potential witnesses. You hear all that and you say, well, that sounds substantial. The last sentence is, judgments about the nature of the president's motives during each phase would be informed by the totality of the evidence. This just is a slap shot over to Congress.
It is. It's saying to Congress, it is really up to you to analyze whether or not the president abused his power, whether he can be trusted with that power. That is fundamentally a constitutional question. It goes to the heart of the congressional evaluation of the president's fitness for office, whether he engaged in conduct pertaining to his office that might be construed to be high crimes and misdemeanors, which is, of course, the impeachment standard, but more broadly to conduct oversight over the president's use of the executive power under our Constitution.
Jeremy Bash, our thanks. Because people come and go so quickly around here, we have been rejoined by the former Solicitor General of this great country, Neil Katyal, who I say to his great embarrassment, just yesterday argued his 39th case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Who needs parents when we have Brian and I?
Exactly. I wish my mom were watching.
We're so pleased to have you here. We have yet to speak to you since the issuance of this, and I presume with your accelerated reading speed and better than average intelligence, you've gotten through quite a bit. Your impressions?
I think the most important thing is actually on page 2. So for the last hour, the discussion on the other network that I was on was basically, does this exonerate the president? And the president's lawyers are going out and saying that. Page 2 says something really important. It says, Barr said he wasn't relying on whether a sitting president be indicted. Mueller relies on it. Mueller says first at page 1, I'm bound by that. I can't indict a sitting president. And then on page 2, he says, because of that, even if I thought there was evidence that could implicate Trump and call him a criminal, I'm not going to do that because it would be unfair. I can't indict him and he would have no opportunity to defend himself. So this is entirely a handoff to Congress. That's what this document is. And so anyone who says this is an exoneration of the president is flatly misreading what Mueller has said in this report.
And that said, when Congress reads this, what's in this that if you were advising House Judiciary, you would go after one by one?
So I think the most important thing does have to do with obstruction of justice, and in particular, what was said, what the president said, the president told McGahn to fire the special counsel, and McGahn is the president's lawyer, this White House counsel, which is kind of like one step under God, like the top lawyer for the executive branch. And McGahn says, I'm going to resign. He calls it a Saturday night massacre and says, I'm not going to do this crazy expletive word. I mean, it's really quite astounding.
It has echoes of a previous administration.
It does. And when you look at this, I think, and Congress looks at it, they have to say, is this someone who is discharging his oath to faithfully execute the laws, which is what the Constitution in Article 2 requires?
Control room is telling me they can put this portion up on the screen and we can all read it. Sessions told the president that a special counsel had been appointed. President slumped back in his chair and said, oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. Use your imagination.
Starts with an F.
That's
You're in your car.
That's the moment.
Yeah, there's that stuff McGahn said. There's a lot of stuff in here, so I think it is not a good day for the presidency or the president.
And yet, the Attorney General seemed rather upbeat this morning.
Yeah, you're looking at the Attorney General, I'm thinking to myself, this is probably the only good investment Trump's ever made. And it's paying off in putting his weight behind this Attorney General. I think the Attorney General sequenced the stuff in a way to make it and take some of the sting out of the report. And most importantly, what he did 2 weeks ago when he said, I'm not relying on whether a sitting president can be indicted or not. He may not have been relying on it, but Mueller was relying on it in writing this report. And then Barr makes a legal conclusion that says, I don't think there's enough here. Well, Mueller himself said, I'm not even going to be able to tell you whether or not a crime was committed.
How much did that determine, and it's my understanding from news accounts that John Dowd, who was, 3 lawyers ago, was made aware of Mueller's decision to adhere to DOJ policy. So the whole time that they were negotiating responses or an interview at that point and then responses to the questions, they knew that it wouldn't end in an indictment. What do you make of what they report or what they detail in this report around considering a subpoena and then ultimately deciding that it would take too long and giving up on the idea of interviewing the president?
Right. Well, there was already a fair amount of evidence, that the president obstructed justice. So you could see a prosecutor saying, look, it's much more important for me to get this information out to the American people and the Congress rather than to fight for 1 or 2 years in the courts about whether a sitting president could be subpoenaed or not. And from Trump's lawyers' perspective, once they know the president can't be indicted, then they're like, party's on. I can do what I want. We don't have to show up. We don't have to volunteer voluntarily, answer any questions we don't want to. And Jay Sekulow was just on TV saying, oh, the president answered voluntarily every question that was given to him that was within the special counsel's original mandate. Absolutely not. The original mandate of Mueller included not just the Russia piece, but also obstruction of justice. That was in the original mandate. It's expressly in the letter. It invokes those parts of the special counsel regulations.
And here's what I was trying to get at with Julia Ainsley. When the president, the angry Democrats tweets we've lived through, when the president talks about the deeply conflicted Robert Mueller, doesn't that go back to a deal where he thinks Mueller was trying to become a member of a Trump club and the deal collapsed? But isn't that the derivation of that?
Yeah, that's the whopping evidence for the deeply conflicted Robert Mueller. And
he played once at his golf club or something.
Exactly. I mean, a golf club? Come on.
Wow. Frank Figliuzzi has another contribution, having read on ahead of us. Frank?
Yeah, I want to keep pulling on two threads, Brian, that we've already surfaced. One is this notion that a question of whether or not the Attorney General is accurately portraying the level of cooperation by the president and those around him. And then the other is this question of whether, because something is not criminal, it means that we can't have it go to Congress or that it's acceptable conduct by our president. So I'm on page 153. This all pertains to Cohen. And we read, there is evidence described below that the president knew Cohen provided false testimony to Congress about the Trump Tower Moscow project. So that's not a cooperative president. That's a president saying, I have knowledge that someone's provided false testimony. My attorney has provided false testimony to Congress, and I'm not doing anything about it. And we have to ask ourselves whether that's acceptable and whether that's cooperation. Next page, the president's personal counsel declined to provide us with his account of his conversation with Cohen. I think that's far less than cooperation, as has been characterized by the Attorney General. And then the very next page, there is evidence that could support the inference that the president intended to discourage Cohen from cooperating with the government because Cohen's information would shed adverse light on the president's campaign period conduct and statements. So we have to ask ourselves, is this cooperation as characterized by the Attorney General? And secondly, is this conduct acceptable from an American president?
It's a mob movie, as you have said so many times, Frank Figliuzzi. Our thanks over to Ari Melber. Ari.
A couple points. I've been listening to your coverage with great interest, including Neil Katyal, and I want to echo this. The most important words in this entire report at a basic level may be what Mr. Katyal was discussing, which is, quote, no charges can be brought against the president. No charges can be brought. Translation, Bill Barr was wrong, was incorrect, was misleading in his letter saying otherwise about Mueller. Now, they may disagree about this, but what Barr wrote in his letter, and this is one of those times, I'll show you, Brian, why we have so much paper. I have the original Barr letter here that says, quote, Mueller leaves it, quote, to the Attorney General to determine whether there were crimes. Now, as Mr. Katyal and others have noted, this may be one of the most important things you learn out of the whole report today. That's not what Mueller did. Mueller said that DOJ policy prevents anyone, him, Bob Mueller, the Attorney General, anyone, from prosecuting a sitting president. And thus the whole report was written with that premise to provide whatever information works in the justice system, potentially for Congress. So that's a bright siren here that Mr. Barr's misrepresentation of the Mueller report began on that core issue in his letter. That's even before the controversial press conference. So I want to echo that with that reporting. I also want to tell you some more what we're finding in this report. You, Brian, were talking about some of the more, shall we say, spicy quotes that Mueller unearthed. I want to put a few more up for context, because I think this will help people understand just what was unearthed here. As we mentioned, Donald Trump's initial reaction to this, I'm effed. McGahn's view of what Trump was trying to do was, quote, crazy S, rhymes with hit, and he was trying to protect people from hearing worse details than swear words. Trump saying, quote, Mueller has to go. He wanted to knock out Mueller, that this whole thing he had to fight, which is analyze as potential obstruction because it could spell, quote, the end of his presidency. And Brian, the Saturday Night Massacre term, a reference to a firing of a different prosecutor that ultimately led to the end of the Nixon presidency. He talked about the end of the presidency. So you take that all together and you see what's on your screen are some of the headlines, storylines that Mueller unearthed. I have one more new thing if we have time, and that is WikiLeaks. One of the most redacted sections as I go through this report is the WikiLeaks section. Whole pages are redacted, which is fascinating for a lot of reasons. One part that's not, though, Gates, who was #2 in the campaign,